You don't have to necessarily have done anything wrong for things to get completely out of control. It's a terrifying doctrine, but it's not a hopeless doctrine because it still says that there's a way forward, there's a pathway forward, and the pathway forward is to adopt a mode of being that has some nobility so that you can tolerate yourself and perhaps even have some respect for yourself as someone who's capable of standing up in the face of that terrible vulnerability and suffering, and that the pathway forward, as far as the existentialists are concerned, is by, well, certainly by the avoidance of deceit, particularly in language, but also by the adoption of responsibility for the conditions of existence and some attempt on your part to actually rectify them. And the thing that's so interesting about that is, well, two, as far as I'm concerned, and some of this is from clinical experience. You know, if you take people, and I've told you this, and you expose them voluntarily to things that they are avoiding and are afraid of, you know, that they know they need to overcome in order to meet their goals, their self-defined goals. If you can teach people to stand up in the face of the things they're afraid of, they get stronger. And you don't know what the upper limits to that are, because you might ask yourself, like, if for 10 years, if you didn't avoid doing what you knew you needed to do, by your own definitions, right, within the value structure that you've created to the degree that you've done that, what would you be like? Well, you know, there are remarkable people who come into the world from time to time, and there are people who do find out over decades-long periods what they could be like if they were who they were, if they spoke their being forward. And they'd get stronger and stronger and stronger, and we don't know the limits to that. We do not know the limits to that. And so you could say, well, in part, perhaps the reason that you're suffering unbearably can be left at your feet, because you're not everything you could be, and you know it. And of course, that's a terrible thing to admit, and it's a terrible thing to consider, but there's real promise in it, right? Because it means that perhaps there's another way that you could look at the world, and another way that you could act in the world, so what it would reflect back to you would be much better than what it reflects back to you now. My experience is with people that we're probably running at about 51% of our capacity. I mean, you can think about this yourselves. I often ask undergraduates how many hours a day you waste, or how many hours a week you waste, and the classic answer is something like 4 to 6 hours a day. You know, inefficient studying, watching things on YouTube that not only do you not want to watch, that you don't even care about, that make you feel horrible about watching after you're done. That's probably 4 hours right there. You know, you think, well, that's 25 hours a week, it's 100 hours a month, that's 2.5 full work weeks, it's half a year of work weeks per year. And if your time is worth $20 an hour, which is a radical underestimate, it's probably more like 50 if you think about it in terms of deferred wages. If you're wasting 20 hours a week, you're wasting $50,000 a year. And you are doing that right now. And it's because you're young, wasting $50,000 a year is a way bigger catastrophe than it would be for me to waste it, because I'm not going to last nearly as long. And so if your life isn't everything it could be, you could ask yourself, well, what would happen if you just stopped wasting the opportunities that are in front of you? You'd be who knows how much more efficient, 10 times more efficient, 20 times more efficient. That's the Pareto distribution. You have no idea how efficient people get. It's off the charts. Well, and if we all got our act together collectively and stopped making things worse, because that's another thing people do all the time, not only do they not do what they should to make things better, they actively attempt to make things worse because they're spiteful or resentful or arrogant or deceitful or homicidal or genocidal, or all of those things all bundled together in an absolutely pathological package. If people stopped really, really trying just to make things worse, we have no idea how much better they would get just because of that. So now you're moving towards the promised land, let's say. So that's inspiring, and that produces positive emotion, because you experience positive emotion when you see yourself moving towards a valued goal. No valued goal, no positive emotion. That's how your systems are set up psychophysiologically. On the negative front, well, maybe anger and bitterness and fear stop you. Okay, so what do you do with them? Okay, now, take good stock of your sinful nature, let's say. You know what temptations you're prone to and what knock you off the beaten track, and maybe you feel guilty about it. You know where your weaknesses are, and you probably have some idea of just what kind of hell you could inhabit if you let those weaknesses get the upper hand. So why don't you just write about that for 15 minutes? So let's say this isn't what you could have in 5 years. It's the pit you could dig for yourself if you decided to, you know, just sit there or dig. Everyone has a sense of that, you know, for some people. My temptation probably would have been alcohol. It calmed me in social situations. It made me feel a closer kinship to people, and it was a pretty good stimulant. And so it was a really good drug for me, and I enjoyed it quite a lot, too much. But I learned that I had better things to do. I wouldn't have stopped without better things to do. And that's
And what did you mean by better things to do?
Well, I was writing my book, Maps of Meaning, when I was still carousing as a graduate student. I'd started to put my life together by that point quite a bit, but I was still a party animal and very social. And but I found that I couldn't think hungover. And not only that, I couldn't handle the emotional tension of what I was dealing with intellectually. It was too, because, you know, if you're hungover, your emotions are more sensitive, especially your anxiety. And the work I was doing was way too demanding emotionally, because I was dealing with historical atrocity, and the motivations for that was just too damn dark, you know, to be dealing with hungover. Plus, once I had written a fair bit and was editing, once you've edited your work to a substantial degree, you have to use finer and finer gradations of judgment to continue to improve it. And if you're fuzzy-minded at all, if you've impaired your judgment, when you edit, you can make it worse, not better. And then I also realized that the only times I really regretted my actions was when I was drinking, because it disinhibits you, and that's fun. That can be really fun. But I'd wake up the next day and think, yeah, I was a little too provocative. I was a little too aggressive. I was a little too mean-spirited in my wit, a little too egotistical, or maybe more than little on all of those fronts. A little careless in my choice of partner, a little uncontrolled in my social behavior in places I shouldn't have been, because, you know, I was starting to, well, I was a graduate student and a teacher by that point, and I was interacting with professors, say, in the social milieu.
Grew,
yeah, well, it wasn't the time to be drunk. That just wasn't good. That worked in northern Alberta to some degree in some subcultures, but in those situations, it just made me look like a fool. Well, it made me into a fool, not just look like one. And then when you and I got married, I didn't, and we were going to have kids. I thought, well, I'm not drinking when I have kids.
Yeah, I wanted children.
Yeah, and you know, you want to grow up at that point. And besides, I was ready to dispense with all of that by then. People are often afraid of moving forward, and no wonder. But you should be way more afraid of not moving forward. And so if you get that hell behind you, it's like, well, do I want to go there? Well, I don't have the effort or the energy. I'm not even sure that it's the right thing. It's like, well, do I want to go back there? It's like, no, definitely not that. And if you don't feel that, hell, then you're not nearly as motivated as you could be. Because if you have any sense of just exactly how bloody dismal and dark things could get, then, and that's right there for you. And that was one thing that...
I thought it was helpful. I thought it was helpful when I did the future authoring to think about where I would go if I went to the wrong place.
Why?
Well, it's just good to know how you will fall apart.
Yeah, well,
that
and then
it's
you
possible?
can, well, and you can also ask yourself, and studying historical atrocity also helped me with that. It's like, well, do you want to be a, what would you call a sadist? You're bitter and resentful. You want to hurt other people? Is that where you want to end up? You want to lie and deceive? Because that's where you end up if you lie and deceive. You want to be resentful and bitter? Because that's where you end up if you're resentful and bitter.
Yeah, but sometimes, you know, people, they just don't know what to do about it. So your program helps them to make a plan.
Yeah, well, and the plan is really, look, we're visionaries, man. Human beings are visionaries. Really.
Well, I found when I did the self-authoring, the 15 minutes of writing that I did, the dreaming I did,
yeah.
when I wrote about my future and just dreamed of what it could be like if it was just what I wanted.
Yeah. And
then outlined the goals, because you outline goals after that in the future authoring. Those things that I had identified appeared in my life. Those,
Yeah, well,
and that was quite shocking to
well,
me.
the thing is, you look at the world through a goal-directed framework, and so when you switch your goals, what appears to you in the world switches. It's mystical in a sense, but in another sense, it's just understandable. It's like, well, if I look that way, I see the TV and the couch, and if I look this way, I see you in the chair. Well, that's not that mysterious, but what I've done is I've changed the reality that manifests itself to me just by changing the direction of my orientation. Well, we do that metaphysically as well. And so, for example, if you decide that you're going to be courageously trusting towards people when they offer you an opportunity, even though you're skeptical and timid, but you decide, no, I'm going to have some faith in people, so I'm going to be courageous and trusting, then when they open a door to you that's an opportunity, you'll think, oh, that's a door I could walk through, instead of thinking I'm moving into a trap. And it's the same reality in some sense, but the way that you're interacting with it changes. Well, it can change, it can invert, it can change so radically that it barely looks like you're living in the same world. There are a lot of potential interpretations that you can validly lay on the world, and some of them are extremely positive, and they still work. And wouldn't that be lovely if you could lay an incredibly positive vision on the world in a calculating and strategic manner, not an instrumental manner, right? Because you're aiming at something genuinely good, and that would work. And that is how the world works. One of the things I loved, maybe we can end with this too, one of the things I loved about my clinical practice, I loved this. It was so good, and I miss it. We were always working, the best parts of me and my client were working together to make everything about their lives better. And it worked. You know, like I had lots of female clients who tripled their income in 4 years. They didn't even think that was possible. It's like, well, I don't make enough money, I'm barely making ends meet, single mothers, I have no idea what to do, I don't like my job. It's like, well, let's make a plan here. You know, what do you want? Well, I'd like to make this much money. Why don't we double that? And just, because you're going to aim at something. Some people do make more money than that, so maybe it could be you. Well, is that even it's not even possible. It's like, well, let's just assume that maybe it's possible and see what you'd have to do. Well, you got to get your CV together. Well, it's full of holes. Okay, well, let's fix the holes. Okay, now you got to get a plan. Well, I'm not very good at interviews. Okay, let's practice interviewing till you're not just good at it, you're looking forward to it.
And I would, think about this, because I'll tell you what it is that you need to do to be successful. Some of these things aren't so malleable, but others are things that you can work on. Well, IQ, well, that's a rough one, because there's no evidence, as far as I can tell, that you can do a damn thing about your IQ. I was just reading a paper by Dan Simon today. It's a relatively recent review. Dan Simon did the invisible gorilla stuff, and he was looking, because there's all these companies that claim that these online brain training exercises can produce cognitive improvements, and he reviewed the literature again, and I've reviewed that literature like 6 times in the last 15 years, because I keep hoping that someone will crack the problem, but it's always the same answer. It's like, you do brain training games, you get better at the game, a lot better at that game. You get slightly better at similar games, but distal games that are still heavily cognitively loaded doesn't affect your performance at all. Zero, none. So the issue of how to raise IQ, man, that's a killer. No one knows how to do it. I can tell you how to stop your IQ from decreasing as you get older. That's not so bad, because it does that. Fluid IQ decreases from the time you're 20 and pretty rapidly. It's physical health is the best preventative. So exercise, physical exercise. Weirdly enough, you think, well, why? Well, your brain uses oxygen like mad, right? And it needs to be kept clean and well oxygenated. And physical exercise, both like weightlifting, so anaerobic and aerobic exercise, both seem to be very, very effective at staving off cognitive declines across the lifespan. So that's a really useful thing to know, because that's the only thing we know that does that. So then the next best predictor of lifetime success is conscientiousness. Well, and of the 2 aspects of conscientiousness, say orderliness and and industriousness, the better predictor is industriousness. So the question is, well, what can you do about your industriousness? And the answer to that is, well, that's kind of rough too, because there's a strong genetic component. But you can work on micro habits with regards to your conscientiousness. And I think the best micro habits, this is partly to do with this future authoring program processes, I think the best thing you can do with regards to your conscientiousness is to set up some aims for yourself, goals that you actually value. And the future authoring program helps people do that. And basically, it does a situational analysis of, it helps you do a situational analysis of your life more than a psychological analysis, I would say. And so the questions are something like, well, all right, you're going to have to put some effort into your life. And you need to be motivated to do that. And so what are the potential sources of motivation? Well, you could think about them in the big five manner. You know, if you're extroverted, you want friends. If you're agreeable, you want an intimate relationship. If you're disagreeable, you want to win competitions. If you're open, you want to engage in creative activity. If you're high in neuroticism, you want security. Okay, so those are all sources of potential motivation that you could draw on, that you could tailor to your own, you know, your own personality. But then there are dimensions that you want to consider your life across. And so we ask people about, well, you know, if you could have your life the way you wanted it in 3 to 5 years, if you were taking care of yourself properly, you know, what would you want from your friendships? What would you want from your intimate relationship? How would you like to structure your family? What do you want for your career? Well, how are you going to use your time outside of your job? And how are you going to regulate your mental and physical health, and maybe also your drug and alcohol use? Because that's a good place to auger down, you know, because alcoholism, for example, wipes out, you know, 5 to 10% of people. So you want to keep that under control. And then so maybe, you know, you develop a vision of what you would like your life to be, and that associates the goal. Well, once the goal is established, and then you break down the goal into micro processes that you can implement, the micro processes become rewarding in proportion, in relation to their causal association with the goal, and that tangles in your incentive reward system. You know, we talked about the dopaminergic incentive reward system, and that's the thing that keeps you moving forward. And the way it works is that it works better if it produces positive emotion when it can see you moving towards a valued goal. Okay, well, what's the implication of that? Better have a valued goal, because otherwise you can't get any positive motivation working out. And so the more valuable the goal, in principle, the more the micro processes associated with that goal start to take on a positive charge. And so what that means is, well, you get up in the morning and you're excited about the day, you're ready to go. And so as far as I can tell, what you do is you specify your long-term ideal. Maybe you also specify a place you want to stay the hell away from, so that you're terrified to fail as well as excited about succeeding, because that's also useful. You specify your goal. You do that in some sense as a unique individual. You want to specify goals that make you say, oh, if that could happen as a consequence of my efforts, it would clearly be worthwhile. Because the question always is, why do something? Because doing nothing is easy. You just sit there and you don't do anything. That's real easy. The question is, why would you ever do anything? And the answer to that has to be because you've determined by some means that it's worthwhile. And then the next question might be, well, where should you look for worthwhile things? And one would be, well, you could consult your own temperament. And the other would be, well, you kind of look at what it is that people accrue that's valuable across the lifespan. So you do a structural analysis of the subcomponents of human existence, and I already did that. You need a family, you need friends. Like, you don't need to have all these things, but you better have most of them. Family, friends, career, educational goals, plans for, you know, time outside of work, attention to your mental and physical health, etc. You know, that's what life is about. And if you don't have any of those things, well, then all you've got left is misery and suffering. So that's a bad deal for you. So once you set up that goal structure, let's say, and that's really in many ways that's what you should be doing at university. That's exactly what you should be doing, is trying to figure out who it is that you're trying to be, right? And you aim at that, and then you use everything you learn as a means of building that person that you want to be. And I really mean want to be. I don't mean should be, even those things are going to overlap. And it's important to distinguish between those, because that's partly, and this is back down to the micro routine analysis. So if I was saying, well, you're going to try to make yourself more industrious. Okay, number one, specify your damn goals, Because how are you going to hit something if you don't know what it is? That isn't going to happen. And often people won't specify their goals too because they don't like to specify conditions for failure. So if you keep yourself all vague and foggy, which is real easy because that's just a matter of not doing as well, then you don't know when you fail. And people might say, well, I really don't want to know when I fail because that's painful. So I'll keep myself blind about when I fail. That's fine, except you'll fail all the time then. You just won't know it until you've failed so badly that you're done. And that can easily happen by the time you're 40. So I would recommend that you don't let that happen. So that's willful blindness, right? You could have known, but you chose not to. Okay, so once you get your goal structure set up, you think, okay, if I could have this life, it looks like that might be worth living, despite the fact that it's going to be, you know, anxiety provoking and threatening, and there's going to be some suffering and loss involved and all of that. Obviously, the goal is to have a vision for your life such that all things considered, that justifies your effort. Okay, so then what do? Well, then you turn down to the micro routines. It's like, okay, well, this is what I'm aiming for. How does that instantiate itself day to day, week to week, month to month? And that's where something like a schedule can be unbelievably useful. Google Calendar. It's like, make a damn schedule and stick to it. Okay, so what's the rule with the schedule? It's not a bloody prison. That's the first thing that people do wrong. They say, well, I don't like to follow a schedule. Well, it's like, well, what kind of schedule are you setting up? Well, I have to do this, then I have to do this, then I have to do this, you know, and then I just go play video games because who wants to do all these things that I have to do? It's like, wrong. Set the damn schedule up so that you have the day you want. That's the trick. It's like, okay, I've got tomorrow. If I was going to set it up so it was the best possible day I could have, practically speaking, what would it look like? Well, then you schedule that. And obviously, there's a bit of responsibility that's going to go along with that, because if you have any sense, one of the things that you're going to insist upon is that at the end of the day, you're not in worse shape than you were than at the beginning of the day, right? Because that's a stupid day. If you have a bunch of those in a row, you just dig, you dig yourself a hole and then you bury yourself in it. It's like, sorry, that's just not a good strategy. It's a bad strategy. So maybe 20% of your day has to be responsibility and obligation, or maybe it's more than that, depending on how far behind you are. But even that, you can ask yourself, okay, well, I've got these responsibilities. I have to schedule the damn things in. What's the right ratio of responsibility to reward? And you can ask yourself that, just like you'd negotiate with someone who is working for you. It's like, okay, you got to work tomorrow. Okay, so I want you to work tomorrow. And you might say, okay, well, what are you going to do for me that makes it likely that I'll work for you? Well, you could ask yourself that, So maybe you do an hour of responsibility and then you play a video game for 15 minutes. I don't know, whatever turns your crank, man. But, you have to negotiate with yourself and not tyrannize yourself. Like you're negotiating with someone that you care for, that you would like to be productive and have a good life. And that's how you make the schedule. It's like, and then you look at the day and you think, well, if I had that day, that'd be good. Great. And you're useless and horrible, so you'll probably only hit it with about 70% accuracy, but that beats the hell out of 0, right? And if you hit it even with 50% accuracy, another rule is, well, aim for 51% the next week, or 50.5% for God's sake, or because you're going to hit that position where things start to loop back positively and spiral you upward. And so that's one way that you can work on your conscientiousness, is plan a life you'd like to have. And you do that partly by referring to social norms. That's more or less rescuing your father from the belly of the whale. But the other way you do that is by having a little conversation with yourself about, as if you don't really know who you are, because you know what you're like. You won't do what you're told. You won't do what you tell yourself to do. You must have noticed that. It's like you're a bad employee and a worse boss. And both of those work, for you. You don't know what you want to do, and then when you tell yourself what to do, you don't do it anyways. You should fire yourself and find someone else to be. Here's some items, so you guys can do a quick big 5 on yourselves. And I'll tell you the upside and downside of it. So, if you're orderly, you follow a schedule. How many of you follow a schedule? Okay. And how many of you don't? Okay, so one thing I would recommend is that you do. And I'll tell you why. Like, intelligence is a very good predictor of academic performance. And there's not a lot you can do about your intelligence. I mean, you can squander it, but it's very difficult to improve it. Conscientiousness, well, it's a trait too, so it's hard to work on, but we know that conscientious people get better grades, and it's reliable, and it's a powerful effect. And so if your time use is organized, then the probability that you're going to be successful is very high. So one of the things you might think about is make friends with a calendar, like Google Calendar or something like that. And I can tell you some tricks about that, because really it is important. Like, and I'm not kidding around about this. If you're low in conscientiousness, it's really going to trip you up as you walk through life. There's not very many advantages to it that I've been able to see. And I'm not assuming that just because you don't follow a schedule, you're low in conscientiousness, but it is one of the items that mark it. The advantage I've seen so far to being unconscientious is that if you become unemployed, it doesn't bother you as much. And I mean, that actually turns out to matter in some situations. So like, you know, if a big company has to shed 50% of its employees, it's the conscientious people are going to suffer themselves to death for it. And the unconscientious people, they're not going to care anyways, because they weren't working anyway. So it doesn't matter if they have a job or not. So here's one way of thinking about making use of a schedule. Often people are afraid of schedules because they think of them as a trap. You know, you make a schedule and it's like this little prison that you have to live inside, and you know, and all you're doing in your schedule is putting down things you have to do or should do, and so, you know, there's not a lot of fun in that. And so not only is it a trap or a prison, but it's kind of an unpleasant one. But a way to work with a schedule in a lot more sophisticated way is to think, well, I'm going to plan the next week, say, because you plan it day by day, but we'll take the week as the unit level of analysis and think, well, I'd like to plan a week I'd like to have. And then your schedule all of a sudden becomes a tool for increasing the quality of your life. And that's a whole different issue, you know, because you might think, what's the emotion that you suffer, assuming you suffer one of these emotions? If you have an essay that's due and you're not doing it, like, would you regard that as a pleasant emotion or unpleasant emotion? Okay, so do you think you can characterize the unpleasantness? Like, what kind of emotion is it? It's guilt, okay. Anything else? Frustration? Yeah, so you're sort of frustrated with yourself. Yeah, you need a slap, right? You think, I need a slap. So, okay, so guilt, anything else? Anxiety? Restlessness? So that's kind of an agitation. Yeah, it's because your body knows you should be doing something, but you know, you're not pointing it in the right direction, so it's shame? Is that reasonable? So, okay, so the reason I was asking you about that is because, you know, most of the negative emotions are associated with neuroticism, but some of them seem to be associated with conscientiousness. And the conscientious negative emotions seem to be guilt and shame, fundamentally. And so recent research, and really recent, I only got this paper like a week ago, I think it's about 4 months old, seem to indicate that conscientious people feel less guilt, but they're more guilt prone. So if they don't do something, that makes them guilty, but they organize their time so they are doing the things they're supposed to do, so then they don't feel guilty. So anyways, back to the schedule. So, all right, you think about your week and you think about your day, and you think, well, how would you improve the quality of a given day or a given week? Well, one of the ways of improving it is to not put yourself into the situation where there are things hanging over your head that you have to feel guilty and ashamed about, because that's a very unpleasant way of being. And you know, if you have an essay that's due in a week and you're procrastinating, then the fact that you have to do that essay can ruin the whole week. And even when you're doing something that's positive, hypothetically, it's kind of that horrible kind of positive that you experience when you know that you should be doing something else. And so that's when you end up watching YouTube videos about like dancing cats or something like that. You know, and it's at best it's a guilty pleasure. It's not a pleasure at all. You think like, what the hell am I doing watching videos of dancing cats, you know? But then you know that you're procrastinating, and that's low quality, very low quality existence. So if you use your schedule, you can think, okay, well, here's some times that I'm going to do this work. And then you can also sort of ask yourself about that when you're designing your schedule. Because you don't want to design a schedule like you're Adolf Hitler telling yourself what to do, you know, because you're not going to comply with it then. What you have to do if you're going to design a schedule is you have to ask yourself, all right, I'm going to set aside some time to study over the next week or to do this essay or whatever it is. How much time would I actually spend studying? An hour or two a day might be a worthwhile thing to schedule in, and I would say don't schedule in more than that to begin with, because then you'll fail and then you'll stop using the schedule. And so the other thing you want to do is you want to schedule in things that you want to do, and then you want to look at the day or the week and you want to think, hey, that's a week I'd like to have. If I had a week like that, it would be good. You know, I'd be caught up so that all that negative emotion doesn't have to accrue. And I would have done a bunch of things that I'm interested in doing, and at the end of the week I'd be in better shape than I was at the beginning. And if you treat a schedule like that, so that what you're using it is to design the days and weeks that you want to have, instead of using it as this little, you know, jail that you have to put yourself in that you're not going to do anyways, then you can learn to use them. And that's one thing you can do to make yourself more industrious, more conscientious. Follow a schedule.
I've told people to learn to use a schedule, and people often hate schedules because they act as their own tyrants, right? They say, well, you have to do this unpleasant thing, and then here's another unpleasant thing you have to do, and then you have to do this unpleasant thing, and you do that for about 3 days, and you think, to hell with this, I'm not doing that, you know, and you fall off the wagon. That isn't what you're supposed to do with a schedule. You're supposed to use it to design the days that you would like to have if you were taking care of yourself. And so some of that is, you know, you wake up in the morning and you think, here's 5 things I have to do that if I don't do, my life will be worse. It's like paying bills, for example, or taking out the garbage. It's like you have to do those because otherwise things degenerate. So you got to put some of those in the schedule, because otherwise tomorrow is worse than today, and that's a bad trajectory. But you also want to build in things, you know, you've got to act in some sense like you're dealing with a relatively recalcitrant 9-year-old. It's like, so, well, here's some things you have to do, but here's some things that if you do, you could reward yourself with. And if you get the balance there between obligation and reward right, then you'll find that you're motivated to do the things. And that's what you want to do. You want to do that so it's sustainable across days and weeks and months. And so you got to treat yourself like a good boss would treat a valued employee, and not like a tyrant would treat a slave, because the slave will rebel. And, you know, people say, well, I don't follow through on my plans. It's like, well, A, they're probably not very well formulated, and maybe you're doing them because of an external moral obligation or something. They're not really your plans, right? And B, you're acting like a tyrant and a slave, and that's a bad relationship to have with yourself. Treat other people as you would like to be treated. It works both ways. You also treat yourself like you treat other people properly. So that's a necessary thing, and often people don't do that. But the scheduling is really important. There's always people out there who are doing far better than you on pretty much anything you want to imagine. And if all you're doing is seeing yourself in their reflected light, let's say, then it's going to be pretty damn dismal. But it's not a good comparison because, well, first of all, there's danger in just comparing yourself to others, period, because they're not you, and God only knows what struggles they had to undertake to get to where they were, or what burdens they're currently carrying that you're not aware of. But you can certainly contrast yourself with yourself, and that's a lot better. It is the only way. Well, it's also the only way of really measuring anything approximating proper improvement. You can actually tell when you're a little better than you were yesterday.
Right.
And you can actually do that. That's another thing that's so interesting about it, is that you can actually make yourself a little better in some way, pretty much, well, I don't know if it's at every moment, but you can certainly do it every day. You're quite different from other people, and you shouldn't be comparing yourself to them because they're not like you. You know, they don't have your family. They don't have your temperament. They don't have your troubles. They don't have your abilities. The only person that has those is you. Compare yourself to who you were yesterday and not to who someone else is today. And see, that's a game you can win. Be careful who you share good news with, because you want to share good news with people who are going to be genuinely happy for you, and that's one way that you can identify those people who are really on your side. Be careful who you share bad news with, because that's equally tricky. You know, you want someone who will listen to you when you're having trouble and allow you your grief, especially if it's a consequence of something tragic, and who won't try to one-up you, you know, because often when you're talking to people, they'll be thinking about what they have to say that's worse, and that's not helpful if you need a listening ear. Make one room in your house as beautiful as possible. I talked a lot already about the necessity of cleaning your room, which is, you know, in some sense a foolish piece of advice because it seems so obvious, but it's not obvious at all. And you'll find if you try it, especially if you're in a household that's not very functional, that you'll encounter obstacles that you couldn't imagine existed while you're trying to put your life in order. And you can take your surroundings beyond order and move towards beauty, and that's unbelievably useful. One of the things that I've been you know, there's lots of different ways to interpret the world, and you can maybe even make a case that there's an endless number of ways to interpret the world. And the problem with that is that it kind of disorients you in terms of what you should be doing. But just because there's a very large number of ways to interpret the world doesn't mean there's a very large number of productive, meaningful, and sustainable ways to interpret the world. And one of the things you do have to do is figure out how you can conduct yourself today so that you don't upset the apple cart in a week or a month or a year. And so, you know, what you do in some sense psychologically is you admit to yourself that your current frame of reference is faulty. And then you start opening the door to a different kind of thinking, which is more creative thinking. It's more lateral thinking. Saying, well, I'm wrong, but that's not necessarily a problem because I could be right if I thought some other way. Well, you know, that's great. Often it works.
Yeah.
And there's almost no end to the utility of trying to figure out which ways that you're wrong.
Yeah.
Because there's lots of them. And every time you discover one, then you don't have to be quite so wrong anymore. That's a really good deal.
Yeah.
It's from the uphill climb that we derive our value, and I mean this technically. So almost all the positive emotion we feel, especially the emotion that fills us with enthusiasm, and that's experienced in relationship to a goal. And so in some sense, you want a goal that you can never attain. So you can always move closer to the goal that recedes as you move towards it. You think, well, that's frustrating. It's like Sisyphus pushing the rock uphill. But it's not, because as you pursue that goal, you put yourself together and your life does get better and richer and more abundant. And that's why the highest levels of virtue and goal are in some sense transcendent. You want them to be above everything you're doing so you can continually move towards something that's more sublime and better. That's what you are. You're here to live, not to sleep. And the problem with the vision of Mai Tais on the beach is that, well, first of all, that's a vision of drug-induced unconsciousness. Second, it's only going to work for about a week. Third, you're going to be a laughingstock in a month and depressed and aimless and goalless. You want a horizon of ever expanding possibility. And so it does happen to people because they've staked their soul on the attainment of an instrumental goal. And it can be a pretty high order goal, but then you think, now I'm there, now what? Well, the answer can't be, well, I'm going to live in the lap of luxury and never have to leave what do you want to be, a giant infant with a gold bottle? You never have to do anything but lay in your back and suck. It's like, you see the problem with that as a conceptualization. It's no, you want to be like an active warrior moving uphill with your sword in hand. And that's dynamic, that's exciting. Lay a disciplinary structure on yourself, get the chaos in check, and then you can move towards a state that's freer. It's discipline first. Like, look, if you're going to become a concert pianist, there's going to be several thousand hours of extraordinarily disciplined practice. That's the imposition of order on your potential, let's say. But what comes out of that is a much grander freedom. And so virtually every freedom that you have in life that's true freedom is purchased at the price of discipline. That it's not some casual self-help doctrine. It's that if you don't organize yourself properly, you'll pay for it, and in a big way, and so will the people around you. And I would say, start where you can start. You know, if something announces itself to you as in need of repair, that you could repair, then hey, fix it. You fix 100 things like that, your life will be a lot different. Now, I often tell people too, fix the things you repeat every day, because people tend to think of those as trivial. You get up, you brush your teeth, you have your breakfast, you know, you have your routines that you go through every day. Well, those probably constitute 50% of your life.
And people think, well, they're mundane, I don't need to pay attention to them. It's like, no, that's exactly wrong. The things you do every day, those are the most important things you do, hands down.
People are afraid of the truth because often if you reveal it, it causes conflict in the moment. Telling the truth is definitely an adventure. Seeking for sure, but also telling. Another way of going about it is to just say what you think and see what happens. That's an adventure because you don't know what the outcome is going to be. So look, there's this old idea that it's necessary to have faith in the truth. And so here's a way of thinking about that. Someone asks you a question and you might think, well, here's the outcome I want, and so here's how I'm going to answer that question. So that's one way of approaching it. But another way of approaching it is, you ask me a question, I'm going to think about the answer, and I'm just going to tell you what I think. And it doesn't matter what the outcome is, because I'm willing to see what the outcome will be, predicated on the idea that there isn't a better outcome than the one that truth produces. Even if it's harsh and terrible in the short term, and sometimes it is, it's like there isn't a better way of doing it. Now, you might say, well, how do you know that? And the answer is, well, I don't know that. That's why it's an article of faith, because I believe, and I believe this deeply, the being that you produce as a consequence of telling the truth is good, by definition, even though it's harsh and often uncomfortable, because you get in trouble. One of the things that I've really learned recently, or learned to articulate better, is that there's a very tight relationship between aspiration and responsibility. The first question might be, do you need to aspire to something? And the answer is, well, yes, because you have to do something. If you just sit there, you'll die. You can't just sit there. You have to go act out in the world. Okay, so act towards what? Well, that's whatever your aspiration is. You have to have an aim. Okay, well, what should the aim be? Well, it should be something worth doing, let's say. Why do something that you don't feel is worth doing? What do you think's worth doing? Well, if you watch other people and you judge when they're doing something worthwhile, you usually judge them positively if you see that they're taking responsibility, at least for themselves. But do you want to be completely useless so other people have to take care of you? That's pretty pathetic. And maybe you could get your act together so you're taking care of yourself and your family. And maybe you could even do better than that and take care of yourself and your family and your community. Well, good for you. That's responsibility, and that's an aim. Well, here's one of the things that's cool about that, is that your life doesn't have meaning without aspiration or an aim. Okay, so you need a hierarchy of values. There's got to be something at the top. It's got to be something important. If you don't have that, your life doesn't have any meaning. So if you criticize the hierarchy, or even the idea of hierarchy, you destroy the idea of aspiration, and then people have nothing. Well, that's not helpful. People are built for a struggle and they're built for a weight, and you want to take on a heavy burden voluntarily. See if you can put yourself together. See what you can do out in the world while you're waiting to die. It's an all-in game. It better be worthwhile. The great people I know are brutally truthful to themselves and other people, and they have insanely adventurous lives. Get rid of everything you say that you only say to impress other people, and just see if you can say what you believe to be true. That's an adventure. That's the thing about the truth, you know? Well, you got to ask yourself, if you're not speaking the truth, who is it that's talking? If you're saying something that you do not believe to be true, it's not you talking. It's something else. It might be the part of you that wants to manipulate the other person into delivering what you think you want from them. Well, what is that spirit of manipulation that you've allowed to possess you? It's not you. Let's say you decide to live your whole life in that instrumental manner. You're going to craft your words like the student who says, well, I'm going to write what the professor wants to hear so I get the grade. It's like, well, you just turn yourself into that. Well, who is it that's doing that manipulating? It's not you, because those aren't your words. So even if you get the grade, it's not you that got the grade. It's the false you. It's the manipulative you. So you do that your whole life. You don't have your life. And then you think, well, God, that was a miserable life. I manipulated everybody. They were so damn stupid. They were sucked in by it. They're all contemptible. Everyone does it, you know, which they don't, by the way. And so that's a pathway to bitterness. Partly because if you're a manipulator and you use your language falsely, you don't live your own life. You live the life of whatever possesses you when you think it's you manipulating. And so you live the life of the spirit of manipulation.
You know, maybe you're in California, see someone speeding down the road in a convertible Porsche, and you think, oh man, what a lucky bastard. And the truth of the matter is that he's thinking about wrapping his expensive sports car around the next cement pillar that he comes close to. You know, you can't tell, and people have hard lives, and
And even people who are comparatively fortunate have hard lives. And the ideal that you're observing that makes you jealous and resentful is in large part an illusion that's created by your own mind. You have to be careful of what you're jealous of because you don't really know what it is. And then the other thing that's kind of useful is to understand you're quite different from other people, and you shouldn't be comparing yourself to them because they're not like you. They don't have your family. They don't have your temperament. They don't have your troubles. They don't have your abilities. The only person that has those is you.
Assuming you want to get better, there's usually something you can figure out that would constitute a step towards some sort of concrete goal. And my presumption, it's a behavioral presumption fundamentally, is that small accruing gains that repeat are unbelievably powerful. You can tyrannize yourself into doing things, but I wouldn't recommend it. What I would recommend instead is that you ask yourself what you're willing to do. It's a really effective technique. It's like a meditative technique. So for example, you can get up in the morning and you can think, well, I'd like to have a good day today, so I'd like to go to bed tonight without feeling guilty because I, didn't do some things I said I was going to do, and I'd like to have kind of an interesting day. So you got to fulfill my responsibilities, and I want to, enjoy the day. Then you can ask yourself, well, what would I have to do in order for that to happen that I would do? And the probability, if you practice this for 3 or 4 days, is your brain will just tell you. It'll say, well, there's that piece of homework that you haven't done for like 3 weeks. You should knock that sucker off because it would only take you 10 minutes and you've been avoiding it and torturing yourself to death for 72 hours straight. And say, well, let's figure out what your aims are. You got to have some aims, whatever they are. And they might say, well, I'm so depressed I don't have any aims. And then I say, well, pick the least objectionable of the aims and act it out for a while and see what happens. Because sometimes your emotional systems are so fouled up that you have to pretend. You have to act the thing out before you can start to believe it. Life can be meaningful enough to justify its suffering. I thought, God, that's such a good idea. Because it's not optimistic exactly. Some people will tell you, well, you can be happy. It's like, those people are idiots. I'm telling you, they're idiots. There's going to be things that come along that flatten you so hard you won't believe it. And you're not happy then. And so if life is to be happy, well, in those situations, what are you doing? Why even live? But life isn't to be happy. If you're happy, you're bloody fortunate, and you should enjoy it. You should, because it's the grace of God, so to speak. People know when they're doing something meaningful. They can tell, so why the hell don't they do meaningful things all the time? It seems obvious. You could do it. I mean, it's hard, because other people want you to do other things, and it's a struggle, but everything's a struggle. Oh, I get it. I see why. It took me about 10 years to figure this out. People have a choice. Choice number 1. Nothing you do means anything. Well, that's kind of a drag, right? It's meaninglessness of life and all that existential angst. That's kind of a pain. But the upside of nothing that you do is meaningful is you don't have to do anything. You've got no responsibility. Now, you have to suffer because things are meaningless, but that's a small price to pay. The alternative is everything you do matters. Really. If you make a mistake, it's a real mistake. If you betray someone, you tilt the world a little more sharply towards evil rather than good. It matters what you do. Well, if you buy that, then you can have a meaningful life. But there's no mucking around. It means responsibility. It means that the decisions you make are important. It means that when you do something wrong, it's wrong. Well, do you want that?
You cite a tired brain, foggy thinking, as the reason to stop answering questions or giving a talk. How do you combat this while working or writing daily? Well, I eat a big breakfast relatively soon on waking. That really helps. If any of you out there are anxious, and many of you no doubt are, there'll be a large number of you who are anxious and don't eat breakfast. There'll be a whole bunch of you out there who think, well, I don't eat breakfast. It isn't necessary. It's like, that's wrong. It's necessary. You fasted all night. If you load yourself cognitively or physiologically in the morning, your brain, stressed, will encourage your body to produce insulin. It will take all the blood sugar out of your blood, and then you're done for the day. And then you'll be anxious. And a lot of the rest of you, too, you'll find if you're anxious, try this. It's really, really interesting experiment. The next time you're anxious, go eat something.
eat some protein and fat would be best. You could have cheese and crackers. I'm not a big fan of carbohydrates, but whatever. Eat whatever you're willing to eat, but make it solid. Don't eat a peanut butter, or don't eat a chocolate bar or something sweet. Eat something substantial, a piece of meat, a piece of cheese, some peanut butter, something like that. And then wait 10 minutes and see if you're less anxious. And try that for like 2 weeks. Every time you get anxious, eat something. Because then you can find out if your anxiety is linked to low blood sugar. And it's very likely that it is, especially if you also get irritable and foggy in your thinking. And the best way to treat that, as far as I've been able to tell, and there's a decent literature on this, is to make sure that you eat a big breakfast. And you might say, well, I'm not hungry in the morning. It's like, who the hell cares if you're hungry? I didn't say enjoy your breakfast. I said eat it. That's not the same thing. There's lots of things that you need to do that you don't enjoy to begin with. You'll get hungry in 6 months and then you'll start to enjoy it. So that's a massive difference. I take small naps quite frequently. If I'm wiped out, I'll go have a nap for 10 minutes or 15 minutes. And then that helps quite a lot. I try to wake up on a fairly regular schedule. That's another thing I would really recommend for people whose lives are in disarray and who are anxious. Try to fix your wake time. Going when you sleep, that's not so important. So you can still, stay up late and have fun and all that. But getting up in the morning is really helpful. So, and you also have to figure out how much you can work or write. I can't write for more than about max. My sustainable maximum for writing is 3 hours a day. And if I push it past that, then, especially if I'm editing, I make mistakes when I'm editing, so that's counterproductive, and I can't sustain it across time. And so I don't really think you can do more than about 3 hours of extremely intense intellectual work a day. Although if you have a nap, you can stretch that, but I think at least I end up paying for it across time. So nap, make sure you eat, and make sure that you get enough sleep. So that's how I combat it and try to make myself hyper efficient. Regulate your habits. Try to get up at approximately the same time each morning. I would recommend that you get up approximately when other people get up. So that would be something in the neighborhood of 7:30 or 8 in the morning, perhaps earlier, perhaps a little bit later, but you want to stabilize that because your circadian rhythms operate more fluidly, and your mood is likely to be regulated better if there's islands of stability in your daily routines. Human beings like daily routines, just like dogs like daily routines. And so regulate your sleep. I would say when you get up in the morning, eat breakfast. That's a really important thing to do. I can't tell you how many people I've treated in my clinical practice whose proclivity for emotional instability and depression, anxiety, general hopelessness, emotional pain and gloom and doom, as well as capacity to concentrate, were properly regulated or inhibited or reduced by merely ensuring that they ate a protein and fat rich breakfast relatively soon after they wake up. And that's especially true if they're stressed. And as it turns out that if you stress yourself after a fast, which is of course what you've undertaken if you haven't eaten since the night before, that your body produces enough insulin to deplete the sugar in your blood. And then it's very difficult for you to become regulated properly with regards to your metabolism until you sleep again. And so it can be regulating your sleep, and your breakfast eating habits in particular can be a very effective way of regulating your mood and increasing your capacity to concentrate. The other thing I would say is that scheduling your time is also extraordinarily useful. And so I can tell you a little bit about how to use schedules effectively. You should develop a long-term plan. So you have to set up your long-term vision. And then I would say once you set up that vision so that you know how to orient yourself, then you should start designing your days. And you can do that very effectively with a calendar like Google Calendar. Many people say, well, I hate using a schedule or I hate using a calendar. What you're doing is using the calendar as an external tyrant that's telling you what you should do if you were going to be a conventionally good person each day. So you load yourself up with arbitrary responsibilities. But that's not really how you should use a schedule. What you should use a schedule to do is to design the day that you would most like to have. And obviously that's going to include accepting some responsibility and undertaking to make progress on those things that you have to make progress on to keep your life from collapsing into chaos. But it should also mean that you schedule in activities that make you actually want to have that day. And so if you're using a schedule properly, that it can be your friend. And that can also be something that can increase your capacity to concentrate. And then I would say, well, if you're very scattered, then you can start to train yourself. You might say, well, I need to learn to read without distraction. So maybe what you do, you say, okay, well, for the next week, I'm going to read 10 minutes a day, and I'm going to try to limit the distractions. And if you're successful at that, then you could try 12 minutes a day. And if you're successful at that, you could try 15 minutes a day. And the trick is to set a goal for yourself that is slightly beyond your current level of performance, enough to be challenging, enough to be worthwhile if you accomplish, but not so difficult that you're likely to fail. And then practice incrementally, day by day, trying to inculcate the habits that you want to inculcate. And assume that it'll take you a number of months or even a number of years in order to become very fluent at the habit. The important thing is to start improving incrementally, because incremental improvement pays off like compound interest.
You know, let's say I was dealing with a client, and maybe that was somebody who, say a man, 35 years old, he still lived at home, so he was too dependent. His room was a complete bloody catastrophe. And, you know, he's living like a bratty 13-year-old, and that gets pretty ugly by the time you're 35. You know, and he knew it, and I'm sure his mother knew it, although obviously she put up with it, which was probably her mistake, at least in part. But maybe we decide, well, you know, let's start by cleaning your room. And so as a cognitive behavioral psychologist, you engage in a process called collaborative empiricism. And that's partly to solve the problem that you described. Is, well, how do we know we set the right goal? Well, we say, well, go try it. And just watch yourself like you don't know who you are, and come back next week and we'll see how you did. And maybe, I remember this one client, he came back and he said, you know, I went and got the vacuum cleaner from the closet, which is something I really never done, and I put that vacuum cleaner in the doorway of my bedroom, crossways, so it blocked the doorway, and then I just walked over it for a whole week. And like, he was completely nonplussed at his own intransigence. And look what he did, eh? He was so resentful and so angry that he, instead of vacuuming his damn bedroom like he planned, he just stuck the vacuum in his own way and then martyred himself over it every day for a week. It's like, okay then, we're starting to get somewhere with the whole you living at home thing here. And so, well, that was too high a goal for him. And you say, well, how do you know that? It's like, well, he didn't do it, did he? So then what you do practically is you say, well, how about you bring that vacuum cleaner into your room this week, and that's your whole assignment. And just watch what happens when you bring it in. Watch the fantasies that flicker in the back of your mind as you live out your resentment at your therapist, daring to make you bring that vacuum across the threshold of your bedroom. And so if people catch those fantasies, whew, that's quite the bloody night and quite the revelation to themselves, I can tell you, because you have to be one angry person to put a vacuum cleaner in your doorway and walk over it every day for a week. And so then we get somewhere. It's like, okay, now we're getting to the bottom of things, you know. But maybe the next week he'd come back, well, with the fantasies at hand and rather shocked as a consequence, but the vacuum cleaner was then in his room. And so he broke the threshold there, you know, and then maybe all he could do was sort out a drawer or half a drawer, something like that. So what you do is, you know, you pick a target that you think is probably reasonable, and you can negotiate that with yourself.
If you're suffering, you are obligated, in a sense, to hold on to whatever rope someone throws you. Life can be meaningful enough to justify its suffering. You can tyrannize yourself into doing things, but I wouldn't recommend it. What I would recommend instead is that you ask yourself what you're willing to do. It's a really effective technique. It's like a meditative technique. That's when life is worthwhile.
I don't know exactly what's going to help you, but don't arbitrarily throw out any possibilities because you might not have that luxury. Antidepressants help a lot of people, and there are technical reasons why that's the case. If you're offered a gift by your society and it works, try it. I don't care what your presuppositions are. The time you see people who are suffering with depression, for example, there's a multitude of reasons, but I'll take one common reason. You could think about it as associated with the story of Peter Pan. Peter Pan is someone who won't grow up, right? Now the problem with Peter Pan is he gets to be king, but it's king of Neverland. Neverland doesn't exist. So being king of nothing isn't that helpful. Well, one of the things that you often see with people who suffer from depression, and I'm not making a blanket statement about the cause of depression because there's lots of them, is that people who don't have enough order in their life tend to get overwhelmed. So for example, if someone comes into me to see me and they say they're depressed, I always ask them a very standard set of questions. Do you have a job? If you don't have a job, you're really in trouble in our society. First of all, your biological rhythms tend to go off the rails right away because there's no reason to go to bed at any particular time and there's no reason to get up. And for many people, if they don't get up at the same time, they foul up the functioning of their circadian rhythms, and that's enough to make them depressed right off the bat, especially if they start napping during the afternoon. They also don't have a purpose. People aren't good without a purpose, and this isn't hypothesizing. We absolutely understand the circuitry that underlies positive emotion. When you're attending to something you're interested in and you're engaged in it, that's when you're alive. That's when life is worthwhile. It's so worthwhile that in those moments you don't even ask the question about it. The question itself goes away because the meaning that you're united with is so powerful that it can push back the adversity that would otherwise characterize life. Nietzsche said, the person who has a why can bear any how. We know how it works. Almost all the positive emotion that any of you are likely to experience in your life will not be a consequence of attaining things. It will be a consequence of seeing that things are working as you proceed towards a goal you value. That's completely different. And you need to know this because people are often stunned, for example. They finish their PhD thesis and their presupposition is that they're going to be elated for a month. And often instead they're actually depressed. And they think, oh, what the hell, I've been working on this for 7 years and I handed it in and what do I do now? And that's what depresses them, right? It's the what do I do now? Well, they're fine if they enjoyed it pursuing the thing. As long as it was working out, they get a lot of enthusiasm and excitement out of that because that's how our nervous systems work. Most of your positive emotion is goal pursuit emotion. If you take drugs like cocaine or amphetamine, the reason they're enjoyable is because they turn on the systems that help you pursue goals. That's why people like them. So if you don't have a job, you got no structure, that's not good. Plus, you tend not to have a point. So you're overwhelmed by chaotic lack of structure and you don't have any positive emotion. Carl Jung talked about this phenomenon he described as retrogressive restoration of the persona. It's a complicated idea, but basically what it means is that sometimes you take a leap forward and you learn some things, but you can't catalyze a new identity, so you try to go back and hide in your old identity. And that actually doesn't work because, well, things have changed and you've learned something and that isn't who you are anymore. And so it's like you have to cut parts of yourself off in a destructive manner to fit back into the person that you were. Now what happens here is that Pinocchio escapes from this tyrannical situation and undergoes this descent into chaos, but he tries to go back home. He tries to go back to what he was. And he can't do that anymore. His father isn't at home anymore. And so when he goes home, he finds that there's no home there. Now, this happens to people sometimes, and it's often a shock to them. So they'll often stay under the thumb of their father. And you think, well, why would someone do that? Because it means they're subject to the tyrannical judgment of their father. They're always concerned about what their father would think or whether their father approves of them, and so forth. And you think, well, that's got to be an unpleasant place to be. Why would you do that? Freud said, for example, that no one could be a man unless his father had died. And Jung said, yes, but that death can take place symbolically. Okay, so there's that part of the idea. And then another part of the idea is, one of the times in your life when you actually realize that you're an individual is when you'll go and ask your parents something and you'll realize they actually don't know any more about what you should do than you do. And that sucks. And that's partly why people are often willing to maintain a tyrant-slave relationship with their father. It's like, on the one hand, you have to be inferior in a relationship like that. You know, you've always got the judge watching you. But on the other hand, there's always someone who knows what to do. There's always someone standing between you and the unknown that you can go ask, what should I do? Well, at some point, you'll realize that the reason you can't ask that anymore is because they actually don't know any more than you do. And then that's a pain. Like that is a symbolic death. And that's also when you establish a more individual relationship with your parents. It's at that point that you could conceivably start taking care of them instead of the reverse. And that's a time that should come. But you have to let that image of perfection go. And that exposes you. Well, that's what happens here. You know, Pinocchio goes home and he wants things to be the way they were, and he wants to stay under the careful care of the benevolent father. But that's no longer possible. He's past that point, and that's why the father has disappeared. And so Geppetto has gone off to look for Pinocchio because he also needs his son, but in any case, the house is abandoned. And so then we see inside the house that everything's covered with cobwebs and everything's gone, and Pinocchio and the cricket sit on the steps and they're very concerned. First of all, they wonder where he went, so they're actually concerned that he's gone, but they also don't know what to do because there's just no going home. And so, you know, that's also the case that once you hit a certain point in your development, well, it's the same thing we already talked about. The answers that you're looking for are not going to be found in your parents' house. It's as simple as that. Now, you could artificially maintain your dependency, but, you know, if you do that for too long, things get pretty ugly. I wouldn't consider myself either naive or particularly optimistic person. I don't think I'm either of those. But this isn't actually an idea. This is one of the only ideas that I've ever found that I really believe to be rock solid. I actually think that it's true. And it's very optimistic because it says you can use your sense of meaning to calibrate your progress through life. But there's rules. You have to aim at the highest possible good that you can conceive. Now, and that's subject to update, because what the hell do you know? But you start by aiming at the star you can see rather than the dimmer one that you can't yet perceive. And then you decide that you're going to do that honestly, right? That's a big decision. So the first decision, I think, in some sense, is a decision of love. You're going to decide that being is worthwhile and that you're going to work for its betterment. And that's a decision that's based on love. And the second decision is based on truth. Having made that decision, you're going to play a straight game. Having made those two decisions, I think that you can allow your sense of meaning to calibrate your pathway. And then what's so interesting is that you hit a state that's as close to paradisal as you're going to hit right away, because being engaged like that, it's better to be engaged in the solution of a complex problem than not to have a problem at all. And that's no different than saying it's better for there to be being than non-being, because being is a problem. And so if you want to have no problems, then you have no being. And you could say, well, being is so miserable that maybe that's the route we should take. And fair enough, but maybe you can have your cake and eat it too. You can have the damn problem. It can be a problem worth solving, and you can be so engaged in solving the problem that it justifies the fact that the problem exists. And then you get to have the problem and the solution at the same time, and maybe that's better than not having the problem at all. And I believe that, because one of the things I have seen, and I've seen this being so interesting when I've been lecturing to people, especially more recently, and this has also manifested itself on YouTube. I'm talking to people a lot about responsibility, and it's young men in particular that seem to be responding to that. And I think that's partly because I think that young women, in some sense, have their responsibility map already laid out for them. It's also less voluntary in some sense for women, because they have more complicated problems to solve in the first part of their life, right? Because they have to get the family problem solved. But whatever. I've been talking in a very delineated manner about responsibility, which is a strange thing to sell to people, but responsibility is what gives your life meaning. And so then you might say, well, then take on ultimate responsibility. And what happens? You have an ultimately meaningful life. And then you might say, well, if your life is ultimately meaningful, doesn't matter if it's punctuated by tragedy or even predicated on tragedy. It's worth it. And I think that's true. And everything I've seen indicates to me that's true. Every time I get my clients to take on more responsibility, you know, And it isn't an injunction. You're a bad person, you should take on responsibility. It has nothing to do with that. You can define the damn responsibility. It isn't something that someone else should impose on you. It's not a matter of doing what you should do in some abstract manner. It's not that. It's the choice of what game you're going to play. And you can play the game of the seeker, I would say, and if you play that game, then everyone wins. And it's the best game you can play. And so the answer, in some sense, to the tragedy of life, to the catastrophe of life, to the fall, is to adopt the responsibility of mortality that goes along with that, and to play that game maximally. And paradoxically, it's in the willingness to do that that the solution emerges. And I have done my best with every single thing I've talked to you guys about. I have done my best to do what Dostoevsky does in his novels, which is I make a proposition and then I spend months or years trying to figure out if I can take the bloody thing apart, if there's something wrong with it, because I want to find out. I want to hit it with a hammer and see if it breaks. And what I've been trying to do is to tell you all the things that I've gathered, let's say, or laid out or articulated or discovered over the last 30 years that I have not been able to break with the biggest hammer that I could take to them. And I guess that's the fundamental one, is that I believe that the idea that lurks in these images, derived from very different cultures, it's the same idea. Life is suffering. Right. Indisputable. What do you do about that? You voluntarily accept it and then strive to overcome the suffering that's a consequence of that. And you do that for you, and you do that in a way that makes it better for other people. And then that works. And one question might be, well, how well does it work? And the answer is, the only way that you can find out is by trying it. That's it. That's the existential element of it. The proof is to be derived by the incarnation of the attitude in your own life. No one can tell you how it will work for you. It's the thing that your destiny is to discover that. And you have to make the decisions to begin with. It's like, because you can't do this without commitment. You have to commit to it first. That's the act of faith that Kierkegaard was so insistent upon. You have to say, I'm going to act as if being is good. I'm going to act as if truth is the pathway to enlightenment. I'm going to act as if I should pursue the deepest meaning possible in my life. And there's reasons to do none of those. They're real reasons. So it's really a decision. But you can't find out what the consequence of the decision is unless you make the decision. I think the same thing happens when you get married, by the way. So if you think you might leave, you're not married. And then you think, well, the marriage didn't succeed. It's like, well, maybe you were never married. Because the rule is, you don't get to leave. And there's a reason for that rule. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't situations where there should be exceptions made for that. That's not the point. The point is that there's some games you don't get to play unless you're all in. And the other thing that's so interesting about being alive is that you're all in. No matter what you do, you're all in. This is going to kill you. So I think you might as well play the most magnificent game you can while you're waiting. Because do you have anything better to do? Really? Why not pick the best thing possible that you could do? Why not do that? Maybe you could justify your wretched existence to yourself that way. I think you could. That's what it looks like. You know, people find such meaning in the responsibilities they adopt, it stops making them ask questions about what life is for. If you have a newborn child, for example, like, unless you're really in a bad way, psychotically depressed, or maybe your personality really needs some retooling, you stop thinking about anything but ensuring that that baby is doing well. And if someone comes along and asks you an existential question about your commitment to that, the right response is, why are you asking me such stupid questions when this is manifesting itself right in front of your eyes? Like, how blind can you be? That isn't a time for questions about the meaning of life. The answer is right in front of you. And if you can't see it, it's not because life has no meaning, it's because you're blind. I mean, that's what the image of the Virgin Mother and the child is all about. It's like, what's the answer to the meaning of life? Here's an answer. It's like, well, I'm going to criticize that. Well, go right ahead. You know, it's like what you're like a what do you call that? A termite gnawing on a temple. There's no utility in that sort of criticism. It's blindness. And it's the same thing with regards to the path of the hero. It's like it glistens in front of you and you can criticize it. It's like, fine, put the cart before the horse and see how far you get. So I thought, to bring full closure to the class, I was trying to solve this terrible puzzle that confronted me and many other people about how it was that human beings got themselves in such a tangle about what they believed. Such a tangle that we were pointing the ultimate weapons of destruction at one another, which, by the way, we are still doing. And I thought, okay, well, I understand that. We need our belief systems. They orient us. And that means there will be conflict between belief systems, and that can be a catastrophe. And that's being played out everywhere, again, in very many ways. What's the solution to that? Well, one possibility is there's no solution. It's just mayhem all the way around. Could be the case. But it seemed to me, as I delved into it, that the proper solution to that was to live properly as an individual, because you're more powerful than you think. Way more powerful than you think. I mean, God only knows what you are in the final analysis. You're blind to your own weaknesses, but you're also blind to your own strengths. And so then I think, well, if you got your act together, it'd be better for you, and instantly it would be better for your family, assuming they wanted you to get your act together, and not everyone does, and then it would be better for the community. It's like, how far could you take that? If you stopped wasting time, and if you stopped lying, and if you oriented yourself to the highest possible good that you could conceive of, and you committed to that, how much good could you do? Well, I would say, why don't you find out? So that's what I think you should do. You should find out. You don't have anything better to do. And there's nothing in it, as far as I've been able to tell, there's nothing in it but good. So maybe you could sort yourself out so that you wanted nothing but the good. And then maybe you could help make that manifest in the world. And maybe we wouldn't have all these terrible problems then. At least we'd have fewer of them, and that would be a start. So it's the answer to the problem of humanity is the integrity of the individual. That's the answer. So, and states that are predicated on that realization are healthy. So, and states that aren't are doomed to stagnation and catastrophic collapse. And personalities that are predicated on self-tyranny and the tyranny of others are doomed to collapse. So, and then you think, well, what's the barrier? And the barrier is, are you willing to accept the responsibility? And part of the answer to that is, reduce the damn responsibility until it's tolerable. You don't have to fix everything at once. You could just start by fixing the things that you could fix. Or you could even do it more. You could do it with even less self-sacrifice. You could start by fixing only the things that you want to fix. God, you can get a massive way that way. So do it. See what happens. That's what you should have been taught in university right from the beginning. It's like, aim at the highest good. Tool yourself into something that can attain it. And go out there and manifest it in the world. And everything that comes your way will be a blessing. And so all you have to do is give up your resentment and your hatred. I know that's a hard thing to give up because you have plenty of reason for it. That's probably a good place to stop. So it was a pleasure. So imagine you have a goal in mind. You want to get to work in the morning. I used to ask my students a question like this, is like, what? Maybe they're going to write an essay. Why are you writing the essay? Why are you in class? Well, I'm in class because I need this class because it's part of my major. well, why did you pick a major like that? Well, I'm interested in psychology. Well, why did you come to get a degree? Well, I think I need a degree to get a job. Well, why do you need a job? Well, I need a job to keep body and soul together, and maybe to be productive, and maybe to, establish a name for myself. And why do you want to do that? Well, because, it's part and parcel of living properly. And why do you want to live properly? And well, then, and how would you live if you lived properly? And at that point, people are usually unable to answer. Because you can just push people with questions about why until they run out of explanations. But the point is that you're always doing whatever you're doing because what you're doing is nested in a sequence of goal-directed actions. And those can be more or less sophisticated. If you're not very sophisticated at all, the nesting might be like 2 structures deep. Maybe you're, you're bored and you want to go get drunk, and why? Well, because you don't want to be bored. And if someone pushes you a little farther than that, you hit them. And, you don't want to delve into it. But if you're sophisticated, you have a pretty good hierarchy of answers. So you might say, well, why do you want to be a productive and generous citizen? And like I said, people usually bottom out there. But you could say, well, that's part of reciprocal altruism, and if I'm productive and generous, then that'll encourage other people to be productive and generous, and if we're all productive and generous together, then there'll be more for everyone, and we'll all get along better, and we'll get along for a longer period of time, and that'll make us all more stable, and that'll make our societies better. And then you might say, well, why is that relevant? You might say, well, because the alternative to that is something like a descent into something approximating hell, and so that's part of a reflection of the divine order and the eternal battle between good and evil. And then you could push it farther than that, and you could say, well, are you going to be on the side of the redemptive hero, or are you going to be on the side of the eternal adversary? Like, you can keep digging down farther and farther, and the farther down you dig, the more you get down into what you might describe as the implicit religious substrate. And it's very much useful to know that and to make as much of that conscious as possible. So now imagine that you've come to this talk tonight because you've decided to aim up. And maybe you haven't formulated that precisely explicitly, but something is driving you in this direction. And then you come to the talk and you find out that I'm talking about something that isn't what you expected, and it doesn't seem to be moving you along on your pathway forward to that end. And what's going to happen is you're going to be disappointed. And you might be anxious too. You're going to be disappointed because disappointment signals that you're experiencing something that's not relevant to the goal that you are attempting to pursue, and that might in fact be interfering with it. That's what negative emotion does. And maybe if you're disappointed in what I say, that also makes you anxious because you assumed that you would come here and I would say something relevant, because you assumed that you knew who I was, and then it turned out that I didn't, and then you don't know who I am, and then you don't know what you're doing here, and then you get anxious. And the reason you get anxious is because that's what anxiety is for. It tells you when the pathway to your goal has been disrupted, so multiple pathways have now emerged. So imagine you're driving your car to work and it quits. And what happens is you get anxious. And the reason you get anxious is because, well, you were beetling along quite nicely in your world, and everything was reduced to like a unidimensional simplicity. You weren't in a car as an object, you were in a thing that took you to where you wanted to go, and it was just doing what it was supposed to be doing, tracking you along the pathway to your goal. And then it fails and you're off on the side of the road, and you get anxious because how the hell are you going to get to work? And what if you don't get to work? And is your boss not going to be very happy with you? And maybe this is the 3rd mistake you've made this week. And what if you get fired? And weren't you an idiot for buying this car? Maybe you shouldn't have a car at all. Maybe you should have walked to work. And maybe you should take a bicycle, because after all, that would save the planet. And and maybe now you have to take your car to a mechanic, but the last time you went to the mechanic, you got ripped off because you're too stupid about vehicles to manage one, and you're kind of stupid about technology in general. And aren't you stupid? And maybe you're too stupid, and isn't your wife going to? That's anxiety, right? And that's the emergence of a multiplicity of pathways, right? And so what anxiety signifies is the degeneration of attentional hierarchy into multiplicity. And the reason you get anxious and it feels bad is because now your body can't compute how much energy you have to put out in order to get to your goal. And so you can't organize the world. You're apt to use more resources than you'll replenish. And if you continue to do that, then you'll die. And so anxiety is a signal that complexity has reemerged, chaos. That's the eternal dragon of chaos. Chaos has reemerged because your narrative has collapsed. And so that's negative emotion. That's what negative emotion signifies, is that it's the collapse of an organizing narrative. And so that's very interesting to know. So you feel positive. If I walk on the stage and I know I'm supposed to go to the front of the stage, say, and the reason I want to do that is because I know I have to talk to you, and and I want to talk to you because I think it's valuable to talk to you, etc. That's nested in a hierarchy of value. And if I see a clear pathway to the front of the stage, then that actually produces positive emotion. And that positive emotion impels me forward, because positive emotion does impel you forward. That's what it's for. That's how positive emotion is linked to action. So if you're enthusiastic because you can see a pathway forward to a valued goal, and that enthusiasm manifests itself. This is true even neurochemically. It manifests itself as positive motivation to move forward. And not only that, if you're moving forward and it's working, your brain tracks the fact that it's working, and then that's linked to dopamine release, by the way, which is what cocaine releases. It's linked to dopamine release. And the other thing your brain is doing, even when you're just walking to where you want to go, if you're successfully walking there, your brain tracks what you're doing. There's circuits that are activated while you're doing it. And if what you're doing results in the result you desired, then the dopamine floods those little neurons that are active, and it makes them grow and flourish. And so as you practice something that's working, the circuit that is activated as you're practicing is bathed in dopamine, and that makes it stronger. And that feels good. It's growth. It's part of positive emotion. And so the positive emotion moves you forward, but also encourages you to develop a habit of that practice. And so one of the things I would bloody well say is, don't make a habit of pursuing things that aren't good for you, because you build that into you. That's what happens if you become addicted to something, you know. You build a little monster inside you that's grown. It's there. It's after one goal, despite everything else. Not a good outcome. So now positive emotion also signals the fact that it's also an energy conservation observation. So as I move forward towards my goal, with each step I take, it's going to take less energy to get to the goal. And so that means that positive emotion signifies, what would you say? It signifies the increasing efficiency of your action as you move towards a goal. So negative emotion signifies the fact that things have got too complex for you to manage, and positive emotion signifies that you're approaching your goal and that there's less demand on energy output with every step forward. And so that's emotion. And that's pretty much worth knowing. And then what happens when you're watching a movie is you infer the goal of the protagonist, or the villain for that matter. You infer the goal of the character that's being portrayed on the screen. You adopt that goal as your own. Then you play out the emotions in your own body, which mimics the structure what would you call the character that's being portrayed on the screen, and you live that all out inside you. And that's also how you understand other people, right? You don't listen to someone and then figure out what they're saying and then infer what they're thinking. That isn't how it works. What you do is you listen to someone till you figure out what they're up to. As soon as you figure out what they're up to, you can adopt that frame of reference. As soon as you adopt that frame of reference, you have the same emotions. And that's what makes you united. And so that's so interesting. And so then you think, look, there's 5,000 people in here. If there were 5,000 chimpanzees, you guys would be tearing each other into shreds, because no one would be able to know what anyone else was up to. But because all of you are here paying attention to the same thing in the same way, you have virtually identical emotional states, and that means instantly your behavior is rendered predictable to one another. And there's no difference between that and peace. They're the same thing. And so what that means is that one of the predicates of a civil, productive, and peaceful society is that everyone inhabits the same narrative. And you might say, well, we don't need the same narrative. It's like, yes, we do, because if we inhabit a different narrative, then we're running emotionally in different directions, and we will not understand each other, and we will run into conflict, and that conflict can become deadly at the drop of a hat. And so it's a precondition for a civil society that everyone is united in the same narrative. And then that begs the question, right? What is the narrative insofar as we're unified? And another question, which is, what should the narrative be? Right? Now, the postmodernists figured out that we looked at the world through a story, but they said their mantra is they became skeptical of meta-narratives, which are uniting narratives. And that's all well and good to be skeptical about meta-narratives, but you run into the problem of internal disunion, because if you don't have a uniting narrative, then you're divided against yourself, and you run into the problem of social disunity, because if we're not looking at the same thing for the same reason, then we can't get along. And those are big problems. Now, the way the postmodernists glided over that immense cataclysmic problem was to offer the proposition that the narrative that unites us is just one of power and oppression, right? And that the fundamental motivation that guides, first of all, even your internal organization, your own internal tyranny, you know, you're oppressing your id or your natural self. And then if you establish a relationship with someone like a marriage, well, that's just a manifestation of patriarchal oppression. And if you organize a business relationship, it's a relationship of mutual exploitation, and so far and so on, all the way up the political hierarchy, all the way back into the past. A more dismal view of human existence couldn't possibly be formulated. And I always think about it as a kind of implicit confession. It's like, so you think the world's all run by power, do you? Okay, I know what game you're playing and attempting to justify, and it's completely bloody preposterous, because first of all, if you tyrannize yourself, you're going to be one miserable creature. Plus, you're going to rebel constantly, as you already know. I'm sure all of you have tried at one time or another in your life to force yourself to do something with a whip, so to speak, and what you instantly find is that you're so condemned to be free that you'll even resist your own tyranny, right? Try telling yourself to do something and see if you do it. I'm going to go to the gym. That's New Year's. I'm going to the gym 3 times a week, 2 hours a day. It's like, no, you're not. You're going to last like 3 days. And then you're going to find an excuse. The rebellious part of you is going to find an excuse, then you're not going to do it. And it's a bloody mystery, isn't it? Because you'd think you could tell yourself what to do. Because otherwise, who are you, you know? You're the part that told yourself what to do, but you don't listen, so what the hell's that part? That's you, that's for sure. So you can't even tyrannize yourself with any efficiency. And then if you're married, men, you're married, try tyrannizing your wife and see how well that works. And like, it might work for 10 minutes, but she's not as big as you, but she's a lot sneakier. And you have to wake up with her tomorrow morning. And so even if you do win the fight, which you won't, she's going to bloody well take it out on you the next day, and no wonder. And so you're bound in that relationship by the necessity of continual iterative interactions, right? And they have to be moderately peaceful, or you're going to tear each other into shreds. And if it's constant conflict, you're both going to just exhaust yourself and die. So how the hell is that going to work? So it has to be at least mutually reinforcing. And maybe if you really got it together well, you could interact with each other in a way that improved your interactions across time. And maybe you're wise enough so that if you were on that track, the way you would experience that in the moment would be as exactly the kind of relationship you'd want to have with someone. And that would be something like the spirit of play and romantic love. And that would be the manifestation of an instinct that orients you across time properly in a relationship in the moment. And that's such a wonderful thing to know, right? That instinct for play and romantic love might be the voice of the wisest instinct you have, the deepest orientation to meaning that you have. You know, because there's nothing more delightful in a marriage or in a family, if you have children, than to be able to engage in something like voluntary play. And you know, if you could have the world set up the way you would want it to, if you had any sense, wouldn't it be something if mostly what you did was something akin to play? And that's equivalent. Christ in the Gospel says, know that unless you become like a little child, you'll never enter the kingdom of heaven. And what does that mean? It means to rediscover that intense immersion in life and that capacity for play that characterized us all as children, that we can't maintain because we have to mature, but that we could rediscover as adults if we were sufficiently wise and careful. And so, and then, you know, if you have friends, it's like, well, you tyrannize your friends? Well, then you don't have friends. You're just a bully with henchmen. And as soon as you stumble, they're going to stab you in the back because you surrounded yourself with craven psychopaths. They're just going to wait for the moment to take you out. That's not a friendship, obviously. And if you're running a business, and those of you who've run businesses who have a clue know this is true, it's like, what happens if you rip off your customers? Well, you can get away with it once or twice, but word gets around in no time flat, and then you're just done and bitter and resentful because your idiot machinations didn't work. But if you engage in fair trade and you're reliable and you deliver what you promised and you're half decently good to your employees and the people that you work for, then they're going to be pleased with you, and they're going to come back and they're going to talk to their friends about how well you did, and you're going to flourish. And none of that's arbitrary. You know, that's all guided by the manifestation of a certain form of attentional priority, right? You go to your customer's house, maybe you're a plumber, and the first thing you do is you listen to their damn problem. And so at least you have enough sense to engage in dialogos, right? You actually want to hear what the problem is, and then you actually want to solve it. And if you do that with some diligence, they're going to be pleased with you because they don't want sewage all over the rug. And so your interests are aligned, and if you offer what you promise, then you're going to evoke positive emotion in them and quell their anxiety, and that's exactly the service that you're offering. And so that means you're acting out the proper story. You're productive and generous and honest, and there's nothing arbitrary about that as a ethos that unites you internally and that also makes it possible for you to exist in a peaceful and productive society.
Stop doing the things that you know are wrong that you could stop doing. Right? So it's a fairly limited attempt. First of all, we're not going to say that you know what the good is or what the truth is in any ultimate sense. But we will presume that there are things that you're doing that for one reason or another you know are not in your best interests. There's something about them that you just know you should stop. They're kind of self-evident to you. Other things you're going to be doubtful about. You're not going to know which way is up and which way is down. But there are things that you're doing that you know you shouldn't do. Now, some of those you won't stop doing for whatever reason. You don't have the discipline, or maybe there's a secondary payoff, or you don't believe it's necessary, or it's too much of a sacrifice, or you're angry or resentful or afraid. Who knows? So forget about those for now. But there's another subset that you could stop doing. It might be a little thing. Well, that's fine. Stop doing it and see what happens. And what will happen is your vision will clear a little bit. And then something else will pop up in your field of apprehension that you will also know you should stop doing, and that you could stop doing because you've strengthened yourself a bit by stopping doing the particular stupid thing that you were doing before. That just puts you together a little bit more. And you can do that repeatedly for an indefinite period of time. And
you know, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to ever be able to formulate a clear and final picture of what constitutes the truth and the good, but it does mean that you'll be able to continually move away from what's untruth and what's bad. And, you know, that's not a bad start. You have to treat yourself like you matter, because if you don't, then you don't take care of yourself, and you become vengeful and cruel, and you take it out on people around you, and you're not a positive force. None of that's good. So you suffer more, and so does everyone around you. And there's a malevolence that enters into it. None of that's good. So that's what happens if you don't treat yourself like you matter. And then, well, what happens if you don't treat other people like they matter? Well, you lie to them, you cheat them, you steal, you enter into impulsive relationships with them. They can't trust you. That doesn't go anywhere. They don't like you. You end up alone at best, and maybe like incarcerated at worst. Like, that doesn't work. And so you watch the people around you who thrive, regardless of what they say. They act out the proposition that everyone matters. And then you have a functional society. And I think, okay, well, if when you act out the proposition that everyone matters, you have a functional society, maybe that's evidence that that proposition is true. It's like, I think it's true. It's unbelievable how little genuine encouragement many people need, and how they had none. No one ever said to them, and meant it, it's not okay for you to be a weak loser. It's not okay. And the reason it's not okay is because you could be way more than that. And it's a crime, an ethical crime, for you to allow all that necessary potential to go to waste. It hurts you, it hurts your family, it hurts the world. Really, really, it does. And people think, oh, okay, I get it. And they do get it, because they know at some level. The other thing people tell me, you know, they say, well, I've been paying attention to your lectures, developing a vision for my life, trying to tell the truth, trying to adopt more responsibility, and things are way better. But the other story is, you've been able to help me put into words things I always knew to be true, but didn't know how to say, which is a good role for an intellectual to play. And so, well, so that's why this all makes me emotional. It's so good, you know, and so much of this has been covered as if it's political. It's not political, what I'm doing. It's not political. I don't tell people that they're okay the way they are. No, I say, no, you could be way more than you are. And they're relieved about that, you see, because if you're in a dark and terrible place and someone says you're okay the way you are, then you don't know what to do about that. It's like, no, I'm not. I'm having a terrible time, and I'm hopeless. You're okay the way you are. Well, then what? That's it? That's where I am? And what do you want to tell a young person? You're 17. You're okay the way you are. It's like, no, you're not. You got 60 years to be better, and you could be way better. You could be incomparably better across multiple dimensions. And in pursuing that better, that's where you'll find the meaning in your life. And that will give you the antidote to the suffering. People have asked me in my book why I wrote it as an antidote to chaos, you know, because, well, there isn't anything technically wrong with chaos. Chaos is a place of great potential. Well, the question is, what's the proper balance between chaos and order? Chaos, potential, and order. Well, the answer is, look, when you're a kid, you're all potential. It's chaotic potential. It can manifest itself in any number of ways. And maybe you don't want to give that up. So you're like Peter Pan. You want to be a kid forever because you don't want to give up the potential. And you look out in the world and all you see are Captain Hooks, you know, who've lost a hand, who are chased by death, because that's the clock in the crocodile. It's already got a taste of him. He's terrified by death, and he's a tyrant. Well, I don't want to grow up to be that. So I won't be disciplined at all. Well, that's no good, because the way the potential transforms itself into actuality is through discipline. And so then you, as you said, this is the trick though. You have to pick a path of discipline. What path of discipline you have to pick is a different issue. So there could be a rule. The rule might not be follow this rule. The rule might be you have to follow some rules. So it's a meta rule. And the meta rule is you have to discipline yourself. And the issue is, well, how? That's not really the relevant question. You can pick a disciplinary path. That's why I often tell my clients, especially young people, they say, well, I don't know what to do. It's like, that's okay. Nobody does. Go do something. Do the best thing that you can think of.
put the best plan you have into practice. It's not going to be perfect, and it will change along the way, but it will change partly because you become disciplined pursuing the path. And as you become disciplined, you become wiser. And as you become wiser, you become able to formulate better and better plans. So you can start vaguely and confused and develop a plan that's not so great, and you start to implement it, and then you accrue incremental wisdom as you implement your flawed plan, and that enables you to fix the plan. And so that's part of that process of incremental self-improvement as well. You don't want someone else's fate. Man, your fate's enough, and your adventure's enough. It's plenty. It's more than you can ever fully realize. And so that's also part of the reason that we all believe that the individual has some intrinsic dignity. It's, don't be so sure that your position and your room is so damn trivial. It might be your attitude towards it that's trivial. And if you're in dire straits and dire circumstances, just look at how much opportunity you have to make things better. Compare yourself to who you were yesterday and not to who someone else is today. The same basic idea, right, is that you have to get your markers for success right, because otherwise you can end up in the situation you described, which is that, like, there's always people out there who are doing far better than you on pretty much anything you want to imagine. And if all you're doing is seeing yourself in their reflected light, let's say, then it's going to be pretty damn dismal. But it's not a good comparison, because you shouldn't just compare. Well, first of all, there's danger in just comparing yourself to others, period, because they're not you, and God only knows what struggles they had to undertake to get to where they were, or what burdens they're currently carrying that you're not aware of. You just don't know any of that. But you can certainly contrast yourself with yourself, and that's a lot better. It is the only way. Well, it's also the only way of really measuring anything approximating proper improvement. You can actually tell when you're a little better than you were yesterday.
Right.
So, and you can actually do that. That's another thing that's so interesting about it, is that you can actually make yourself a little better in some way, pretty much. Well, I don't know if it's at every moment, but you can certainly do it every day. It's funny. I mean, you know, obviously, if you have a problem and you think about it, you can think up a solution. And it's not obvious how you do that. You know, I mean, it's not like you know how you're manipulating your neurons or something. Mm-hmm. It happens of its own accord in some sense, like you can participate in it, I guess, and you can interfere with it, and it seems to take a certain amount of willpower, but it still all happens mysteriously behind the scenes. Can you get a job or a career? Can you educate yourself? Can you regulate the draw of temptation, drug and alcohol use in particular, sexual temptation as well? Oh, do you do anything that's remotely resembling civic responsibility? Are you a member of a political party? Do you go to church? You know, I don't go to church because, you know, their beliefs don't match mine. It's like, who the hell cares about your beliefs? You're like 16. You don't even have beliefs. And if you think it's like you're right and the Catholic Church is wrong, well, good luck with that attitude. And that isn't to say that the church, for example, or a political party doesn't need repair, because all institutions are always falling apart and corrupt. That's a story as old as time. That's the evil uncle. But good, you have something to do. Go fix it up. Definition of man. What am I, a biologist? But as it happens, I am a biologist, so I guess I don't have that excuse. Productive generosity is good. I once read a good description of Christian charity, and it was productivity plus generosity, which I really liked, because the hyper empathic types only concentrate on the generosity end of that. It's like, I'm generous, yeah, but like, do you have any money? No, I'm generous with other people's money. Yeah, well, you know, you're missing half the equation there. And that's really the distinction between conscientiousness and agreeableness from a personality perspective. Those are two cardinal personality traits. And agreeableness, which is basically an empathy dimension, has no correlation whatsoever with success in enterprise, business, creative domains. In fact, among managers, agreeableness looks like it's slightly negatively correlated with success, because hyper-agreeable managers can't say no. They can't discipline their employees. They can't set limits. And they're susceptible to manipulation. So productive generosity is pretty good. There is more to it, obviously, more to being a man than productive generosity. But as a central notion, that's a good one. The productivity requires aim, orientation, responsibility, discipline, all of that, that willingness to work, that willingness to make sacrifices, which is the hallmark of maturity in the service of a higher goal. And that responsibility, the productive responsibility, should manifest itself in relationship to the individual. So you should be responsible to yourself and your future self, the community of selves that you are across time. And then you should be responsible for and productive for as many people as you can manage. And so that might be first your intimate partner, your wife, second your parents, your siblings, your children, maybe your children primarily, although there's a trade-off there with your wife. Then your local community, then your broader community. You want to take on all that responsibility if you can, in a sense that's both productive and generous, that gives you something to do, justify your miserable life to yourself and everyone else. And you need to do that. It orients you solidly in the world if you do that. And it gives you a dragon to fight, a real one. And that's where the gold is. So as everyone has known forever, and as we continue to remind ourselves, how should you arm yourself? Well, that's kind of what a humanities education teaches you to some degree. Arm yourself with words. Be precise in your language. Right? Say what you mean. Read. Read great men and great women. Make yourself literate. Get your tongue in order. Get it under your own control. Get rid of the ums and the likes and the you knows and the pauses. And get rid of everything you say that you only say to impress other people. And just see if you can say what you believe to be true. That's an adventure. That's the thing about the truth, If you aren't speaking the truth, well, you got to ask yourself, if you're not speaking the truth, who is it that's talking? If you're saying something that you do not believe to be true, it's not you talking. It's something else. It might be the part of you that wants to manipulate the other person into delivering what you think you want from them. Well, what is that spirit of manipulation that you've allowed to possess you? It's not you. Let's say you decide to live your whole life in that instrumental manner. You're going to craft your words like the student who says, well, I'm going to write what the professor wants to hear so I get the grade. It's like, well, you just turn yourself into that. Well, who is it that's doing that manipulating? It's not you, because those aren't your words. So even if you get the grade, it's not you that got the grade. It's the false you. It's the manipulative you. So you do that your whole life. You don't have your life. And then you think, well, God, that was a miserable life. I manipulated everybody. They were so damn stupid. They were sucked in by it. They're all contemptible. Everyone does it, which they don't, by the way. And so that's a pathway to bitterness. Partly because if you're a manipulator and you use your language falsely, you don't live your own life. You live the life of whatever possesses you when you think it's you manipulating. And so you live the life of the spirit of manipulation. And there's no difference between that in some fundamental sense and demonic possession. So if that's what you want, go right ahead. But what you miss is the adventure of your own life. Because if you say what you think, this is a really important thing to understand. You have no idea what will happen if all you do is say what you think. Because you have to let go of everything. Just to do that, you have to assume that there isn't anything better that can happen than what happens if you tell the truth, no matter what happens. Because you say, I'll tell the truth and I get in trouble. It's like, well, is that good or bad? Well, it's not so good when it's happening. When you get in trouble, that can be devastating. But in the medium term or the long term, in my situation, I've gotten in trouble plenty of times for things I've said. And many times I thought, that was fatal. That was the end. I said something or it was misinterpreted. But often I said something that I was going to get taken out. I was going to get canceled. And that was the end of my reputation. And every single time, and I hope partly because I didn't say things that I didn't think were true, every single time it switched around. And so eventually, the cancellation attempt not only failed, but massively backfired. But man, living in that gap between when the pressure was on, let's say, and it turned around, that wasn't pleasant. But it's certainly adventurous because you don't know what's going to happen. And maybe that is the adventure of your life, right? Imagine that the world was constituted so that the true adventure of your life emerged as a consequence of truth in speech and action, because that would be reflective of the real you, so it would be you living. And then imagine that the adventure that would occur if you dwelled in the truth would be so overwhelming that it would justify all the suffering. And I think that's true. The great people I know are brutally truthful to themselves and other people, and they have insanely adventurous lives. And they also get more and more and more competent. I've talked to my daughter a lot about this. My daughter runs my companies. My daughter didn't know much about business when she started, and she was pretty sick too, and she didn't know a lot. And so it was easy for people who thought they knew a lot about business to pull the wool over her eyes. And but Michaela has the ability to ask stupid questions, and we've talked about that a lot. It's like, you only have to ask a stupid question once if you're alert. You ask a stupid question, and if you're in a crowd and you ask a stupid question, 80% of the people in the crowd have the same question. They're just too cowardly to ask. But you ask, and then someone actually tells you, you never have to ask that question again. You're no longer stupid.
I worked with this crazy psychologist. He used to put jokes on his multiple choice tests. He was a really eccentric guy, but I really liked his courses. He taught a course on creativity, and he was also a prison psychologist. And he was an eccentric guy, and he, for some reason, liked me, and maybe because I was eccentric too. And he invited me to go out to the Edmonton maximum security prison with him a couple of times, which I did. And that was a very interesting experience, because I was trying to figure out what role each individual's behavior bore to the pathology of the group. It was something like that. And I went out there, and I met a little guy, smaller than me. I was a little bigger by then. And he was a pretty innocuous guy. And what had happened was, I was out in this gymnasium. It looks like a high school, a prison, which is really quite telling in my estimation. And there were all these like monsters in there weightlifting, and like they were monsters. I remember one guy was tattooed everywhere, and he had like a huge scar running down the middle of his chest. It looked like someone had hit him with an axe, and you know, and I was in there, and I had this weird cape that I used to wear that I bought in Portugal, and some boots that went along with it. And yeah, it was like an 1890s Sherlock Holmes cape, and it was really like, it was from the 1890s, because this little village was up on a hill. It was a walled city on a hill, and they sold these things, and I don't think they'd changed the style since 1890, and so I thought they were really cool, and so I was wearing that, which wasn't perhaps the most conservative garb to don if you're going to go to a maximum security prison. So anyways, I was in the gymnasium, and the psychologist left. And God only knows, I mean, that's what he was like. And all these guys came around me, you know, and they were offering to trade their prison clothes for my cape. And it was, it was like, I was being made an offer I couldn't refuse, you know, and so I didn't really know what to do. And then this little guy said something like, the psychologist sent me to come and take you away, or something like that. And so I thought, well, better this little guy than all these monsters. So we went outside the gym through some doors, like school doors. We went outside the gym into the exercise yard, I guess, and we were wandering along, and he was talking to me, and he seemed like a kind of an innocuous guy. And then the psychologist showed up at the door and motioned us back, and so, which was kind of a relief. And so I went into his office, and he said, you know that guy that you walked out in the yard with? And I said, yeah. He said, he took 2 cops one night, and he had them kneel down, and while they were begging for their lives, he shot them both in the back of the head. And I thought, see, the thing that was so interesting was that he was so innocuous, right? Because what you'd hope is that someone like that would be very much unlike you, let's say, and certainly wouldn't be like someone innocuous that you'd met. What you'd want is that the guy would be like, you know, half werewolf and half vampire, so you could just tell right away that he was a cold-blooded killer. But no, he was this sort of ineffectual little guy who was certainly not ineffectual if you gave him a revolver and the upper hand. And so that made me think a lot about the relationship between being innocuous and being dangerous. And then another thing happened. I met another guy out there, and then a week or 2 later I heard that he and a friend of his had held another guy down and pulverized his left leg with a lead pipe, like just pulverized it. And the reason for that was that they thought that he was a snitch, and maybe he was. And that time I did something different. Instead of being shocked and horrified by that, although I certainly was, I thought, how in the world could you do that? Because I didn't think I could do that. Eh? I didn't think that, I thought that there was a qualitative distinction between me and those people. And so I spent about 2 weeks trying to see if I could figure out under what conditions I could do that. Like what kind of psychological transformation I would have to undergo to be able to do that. And so that was a meditative exercise, let's say. And it only took about 10 days for me to realize that not only could I do that, that it would be a hell of a lot easier than I thought it would be. And that's sort of where that wall between me and what Jung described as the shadow started to fall apart. And that also was very useful because I started to treat myself as a somewhat different entity because I hadn't been aware up to that point, you know, because I thought I was a good guy. And there's no reason for me to think that, because you're not a good guy unless you've really made a bloody effort to be a good guy. You're just not. It's not easy. And so you're probably a moderately bad guy. And that's a long ways from being an absolutely horrible guy, but it's also a long ways from being a good guy. And so, but I had a little more respect for myself after that, because I also understood that there was a monstrous element to the human psyche that you needed to respect. And that was part of you, that you should regard yourself in some sense as a loaded weapon. It's very useful around children to regard yourself as a loaded weapon, because around children you are a loaded weapon. And the terrible experiences that many children have with their parents are testament to that.
Let's say you want to become who you could be in the fullest sense. So let's say you're someone who's going to solve some serious problems. Okay, the first thing you have to do is admit to the seriousness of the problems. That's no joke. And so the first thing is just the terror of the problem itself. And that's enough to paralyze you, right? And that's the Hydra, that's the Gorgon with the head of snakes. It'll paralyze you and turn you to stone. That's the basilisk in the Harry Potter series. Mm-hmm. You look at it and it turns you to stone and lurks underneath everything, right? And it's malevolence and tragedy. And so there's that. And then the next is, well, you're going to take responsibility for that? You're really going to do that, are you? That's a hell of a load, man. And so it's daunting to even consider that. And then there's the discipline and responsibility that necessitates, which is also daunting. It's like, oh my God, the problem's that serious. I'm really going to have to get my act together in order to not contribute to it, much less solve it. And so the problem is terrible, and then the solution is daunting. But the upside of that is like, well, there isn't anything better to have than a problem that's worth solving, like that's really worth solving, right? And so the more of that you take on, the more you have a reason to get out of bed in the morning, no matter what. Like, I'm getting up, I'm trudging forward. Doesn't matter what I'm suffering from. I've got things that need to be done. They're necessary. And that gives you that sense of purpose that is the antidote to bitterness. Okay, well, let's say you want your life to be meaningful. It's like, okay, then what you do matters. It actually matters.
Or how starting to clean up the room changed their life. That's quite fun, because it's something I always tell people to do instead of going out and protesting. Jesus, I just can't stand
Cleaning up
that.
the room?
Yeah.
Meaning?
Well, my sense is that if you want to change the world, you start from yourself and work outward, because you build your competence that way. It's like, I don't know how you can go out and protest the structure of the entire economic system if you can't keep your room organized. Well, I made a video call, which was called Message to Millennials, where it was called How to Change the World Properly. A bit of on the pretentious side, I suppose, but I was trying to produce something that was a counterposition to this idea that what you should do is go out and fix up other people. You know, that's just not right. And there's a New Testament line about that, something about, you know, not worrying too much about the log in your neighbor's eye, or about the speck in your neighbor's eye when you have a log in your eye. What would the world be like if people stopped avoiding the things they knew they should do? You know, because the question is, how much are we contributing to the fact that life is an existential catastrophe and a tragedy? How much is our own corruption contributing to that? That's a really worthwhile question. The things you leave undone because you're angry, you're resentful, you're lazy, you have inertia. Well, you consult your conscience and it says, well, you know, that place over there could use a little work. It's the same as working on yourself, and so you clean that up because you can. And then things are a little clearer around you. And you're a little better off because you've practiced a bit, and And so you're a little stronger, and then something else manifests itself and says, well, maybe you could like take a crack at fixing me up too. So you decide to do that, and then that gets a little bit more pristine, you know, and soon, and it's humble because you're not exceeding your domain of competence. You know, it's like, don't be fixing up the economy, 18-year-olds. You don't know anything about the economy. It's a massive, complex machine beyond anyone's understanding, and you mess with it at your peril. So, and can you even clean up your own room? No. Well, you should think about that. You should think about that. What could you do to improve yourself? Well, let's step one step backwards. The first question might be, why should you even bother improving yourself? And I think the answer to that is something like, so you don't suffer any more stupidly than you have to. And maybe so others don't have to either. It's something like that. You know, like there's a real injunction at the bottom of it. It's not some casual self-help doctrine. It's that if you don't organize yourself properly, you'll pay for it, and in a big way, and so will the people around you. Now, and you could say, well, I don't care about that, but that's actually not true. You actually do care about that, because if you're in pain, you will care about it. And so you do care about it, even if it's just that negative way, you know. It's very rare that you can find someone who's in excruciating pain who would ever say, well, it would be no better if I was out of this. It's sort of pain is one of those things that brings the idea that it would be better if it didn't exist along with it. It's incontrovertible. So you get your act together so that there isn't any more stupid pain around you than necessary. Well, so then the question might be, well, how would you go about getting your act together? And the answer to that, and this is a phenomenological idea too, it's something like, look around for something that bothers you and see if you can fix it. So now you think, well, let's say you go into you can do this in a room. It's quite fun to do it just when you're sitting in a room, like a room, maybe your bedroom. You can sit there and just sort of meditate on it and think, okay, if I wanted to spend 10 minutes making this room better, what would I have to do? And you have to ask yourself that, right? It's not a command, it's like a genuine question. And things will pop out in the room that you know, like there's a stack of papers over there that's kind of bugging you, and you know that maybe little order there would be a good thing, and you know you haven't, there's some rubbish behind your computer monitor that you haven't attended to for like 6 months, and the room would be slightly better if it was a little less dusty and the cables weren't all tangled up the same way. And like if you allow yourself just to consider the expanse in which you exist at that moment, there'll be all sorts of things that'll pop out in it that you could just fix. And you know, I might say, well, if you were coming to see me for psychotherapy, the easiest thing for us to do first would just be to get you to organize your room. You think, well, is that psychotherapy? And the answer is, well, it depends on how you conceive the limits of your being. And I would say, start where you can start. You know, if something announces itself to you, which is a strange way of thinking about it, as in need of repair, that you could repair, then, hey, fix it. You fix 100 things like that, your life will be a lot different. You know, I often tell people too, fix the things you repeat every day, because people tend to think of those as trivial, right? You get up, you brush your teeth, you have your breakfast, you know, you have your routines that you go through every day. Well, those probably constitute 50% of your life. And people think, well, they're mundane, I don't need to pay attention to them. It's like, no, that's exactly wrong. The things you do every day, those are the most important things you do. Hands down. All you have to do is do the arithmetic. You figure it out right away. So 100 adjustments to your broader domain of being, and there's a lot less rubbish, and there's a lot less rubbish around, and a lot fewer traps for you to step into. And so that's in keeping with Jung's idea about erasing once you've got your mind and your emotions together, and once you're acting that out, then you can extend what you're willing to consider yourself and start fixing up the things that are part of your broader extent. Now, sometimes you don't know how to do that. So you might say, imagine you're walking down Bloor Street and there's this guy who's like alcoholic and schizophrenic and has been on the streets for 10 years. He sort of stumbles towards you and, you know, incoherently mutters something. That's a problem. And it would be good if you could fix it, but you haven't got a clue about how to fix that. You just walk around that and go find something that you could fix, because if you muck about in that, not only is it unlikely that you'll help that person, it's very likely that you'll get hurt yourself. So, you know, just because while you're experiencing things announce themselves as in need of repair doesn't mean that it's you right then and there that should repair them. You have to have some humility. You know, you don't walk up to a helicopter that isn't working and just start tinkering away with it. You have to stay within your domain of competence. But most of the time, if people look at their lives, you know, it's a very interesting thing to do. I like the idea of the room, because you can do that at the drop of a hat. You know, you go back to where you live and sit down and think, okay, I'm going to make this place better for half an hour. What should I do? And you have to ask, and things will just pop up like mad. And it's partly because your mind is a very strange thing. As soon as you give it a name, a genuine aim, it'll reconfigure the world in keeping with that aim. That's actually how you see to begin with. And so if you set it a task, especially, you have to be genuine about it, which is why you have to bring your thoughts and emotions together, and then you have to get them in your body so you're acting consistently. You have to be genuine about the aim, but once you aim, the world will reconfigure itself around that aim, which is very strange. And it's technically true. You know, the best example of that, you have all seen this video where you watch the basketballs being tossed back and forth between members of the white team versus the black team, and while you're doing that, a gorilla walks up into the middle of the video and you don't see it. It's like, you know, if you thought about that experiment for about 5 years, that would be about the right amount of time to spend thinking about it, because what it shows you is that you see what you aim at. And that, man, if you can get one thing through your head as a consequence of even being in university, that would be a good one. You see what you aim at. And so, because one inference you might draw from that is, be careful what you aim at, right? What you aim at determines the way the world manifests itself to you. And so if the world is manifesting itself in a very negative way, one thing to ask is, are you aiming at the right thing? Now, you know, I'm not trying to reduce everybody's problems to an improper aim. People get cut off at the knees for all sorts of reasons. You know, they get sick, they have accidents. There's a random element to being, that's for sure. And so you don't want to take anything, even that particular phrase, too far. You want to bind it with the fact that random things do happen to people, but it's still a great thing to ask. And it's also very much worth thinking about with regards to setting up your life in general. It's like, if you concentrate solely on your career, you can get a long way in your career. And I would say that that's a strategy that a minority of men preferentially do. That's all they do. They work like 70, 80 hours a week. They go flat out on their career. They're staking everything on the small probability of exceptional status in a narrow domain. But it's hard on them. They don't have a life. It's very difficult for them to have a family. They don't know how to take any leisure activity. Like, they get very one-dimensional. Now, it may be that that unidimensionality is the price you have to pay to be exceptional at one thing, right? Because if you're going to be something like a genius level mathematician and you want to do that or a scientist, say, it's like you're in your lab all the time, you're working 70 hours a week or 80 hours a week, you're smart, you're dedicated, you're unidimensional, and that's how you get to beat all the other people who are doing that. It's the only way. But the problem is you don't get a life. Now, if you love being a scientist and you have that kind of focus of mind, well, first of all, you're a rare person, and second, you're going to pay for it. But fine, more power to you. But it's a risky business to do that. You sacrifice a lot for it. You know, and I would say most often, if you're speaking about having a healthy life, that isn't what you do. You spread yourself out more. So, you know, you have a family, you have some things that you do outside of work that are meaningful to you and useful. You have a network of friends. Well, those 3 things alone, or 4 things alone, are plenty to keep you well oriented. And then if one of those things collapses, you know, everything doesn't go. Now, the price you pay for that is the more you strive to optimize that balance, the less likely you are to be fantastically successful at any single one of them. But you might have a very, you know, if you consider your life as a whole, that might be a winning strategy. One of the things Carl Jung said, I really liked this. He thought that men went after perfection and women went after wholeness. So they're different value, they're different, there's something different at the top of the value hierarchy. So perfection would be stake it all on one thing and look for radical success. Not that all men do that, because they don't, but we're talking about extremes, at least with regards to the men that do that. The wholeness idea is more like, well, it's like I want one thing in my life to be 150%, or I want 5 things in my life to be 80%. Well, there's a lot more richness in a life where you have 5 things operating at 80%, but you're not operating at any of them at 150%. So, and I really believe this because I've watched men and women go through their careers now for a long period of time, and one of the things that, there's lots of things that produce this, but one of the things that I've noticed is that mostly women in their 30s bail out of unidimensional careers. They won't do them. They won't put in the 80 hours a week that they would have to put in order to dominate that particular area. And it isn't, the reason that they won't do it is because they decide it's not worth it. And no wonder, because why would that be worth it? You have to ask yourself that. It's like, well, you want to be an outstanding scientist. It's like, okay, really, that's what you want, because that means that's what you do. Because you're competing with other people, you know, they're smart, they're hardworking, and if you want to be at the top, you have to be smarter and work harder than any of them. And working hard means working long hours. I mean, it also means working diligently, but in the final analysis, it's also an additive issue. If I'm smart and hardworking and I can crank out for 70 hours a week, and you do it for 30, it's like, in 2 years, I'm so far ahead of you, you will never ever catch up. So, anyways. And I think partly, maybe part of the reason too that women are oriented that way more than men, I think there's 2 reasons. One is socioeconomic status does not make women more attractive on the mating market, but it does make men more attractive. And the second is women's time frame is compressed, right? Because guys can always say, well, I'll have kids later, and they can say that till they're like 80. Whereas women, it's like, no way, man, you got to get it together by the time you're, let's say 40, but really probably by 35, but definitely by 40, because otherwise it ain't happening. And that's bloody dreadful. Like, the most unhappy people you ever see, no. No. One of the common routes to extreme unhappiness is to want children and not have them. I wouldn't recommend that. You know, you see couples who are in their 30s. 1 couple in 3 over the age of 30 has fertility problems. That's defined as inability to conceive after 1 year of trying. 1 in 3. So it's worth thinking about, because people are very, very unhappy if they want to have kids and then they can't. Man, you're in the medical mill for 10 years if that's what happens to you. Well, so you're moving from point A to point B in your little circumscribed world. You've made everything invisible, and as long as that works, then your theory's good enough. It's accurate enough, it's true enough, you're in your little paradise. But if something comes up and objects, well, that's where your character is tested fundamentally. That's the character test. It's like, what do you do with messages of error? And that's a tricky issue. Okay, so here's a solution to that. Here's what not to do. I am a bad person. I got to see myself. I'm a bad person. I might as well just go jump off the bridge. It's like, no, that's not good, because what that means is that every time you try to learn something, you're going to make a mistake, because what do you know? So you're going to make mistakes. And if the rule is every time you make a mistake, you're going to go jump off the bridge, then that's not a useful problem-solving strategy. And so when you make a mistake, you don't get to beat yourself to death with a club. It's a bad strategy, and you'll have your internal tyrant in there who's perfectly happy about doing that. That's the, you know, overactive superego that Freud talked about. Maybe it came to you via a parent who was too authoritarian, or a grandparent, or maybe it's just you because you're disagreeable and neurotic, and so you'll take or hyper-conscientious. You'll take yourself apart. Well, you've got a problem. Something has objected to you. Then the question is, well, what does that mean? Well, maybe you're not looking at the world right. Maybe your goals are wrong, maybe you're not acting properly. It's okay. So the question that arises when an obstacle emerges is, which part of this structure needs attention? And the first answer can't be all of it, which is why when you're arguing with someone in an intimate relationship and you're angry at them and you want to win, which is a big mistake, you want to win, you say, well, you're this is what you're like. Here's another 10 examples of how you've done that in the past, and I can enumerate more of them if you'd like. And so that's actually what you're like, and I've tried fixing you and it didn't work, and so it looks like you're going to be like that up into the future, and you're basically saying to them, well, you're a bad person, and the only thing they can do is either collapse or punch you. And punching you is actually better than collapsing. You know what I mean? It's such a counterproductive way of arguing. You don't leave the person any out. And so maybe, well, they're civilized, so it doesn't get physical. Well, maybe that's good and maybe it isn't. But then they end up either really not happy with you in a way that they will manifest the first possible opportunity they get, or they have to go off in the corner and cringe. It's like, great, you won. It's like now your partner's either hates you or is cringing. It's great. That's a real good victory, man. Rack up about 100 victories like that and you'll be in divorce court and spending $250,000 while being miserable about it. Yeah. So anyway, so something objects to you and you think, okay, well, I need to take myself apart, right? Because there's a piece that's broken somewhere. And then you might think, well, let's assume it's a little piece to begin with. That's the right mechanism. It's like, okay, you got a C-. That doesn't prove that you're stupid. Now, it implies that you might be stupid, but it doesn't, right, really, it does, and that's why you don't want to look at it. Maybe it implies that you're lazy, or implies that you're ignorant, or like it implies all sorts of terrible. It might imply that you're a bad person even. But you don't want to leap to that, and that's sort of the proclamation of innocence before guilt. Assume that you're the least amount of reprehensible and ignorant possible. And so then you look at the micro routines. It's okay, well, I got a C- in this course. Maybe I should study for that course 15 minutes more a day for the next 3 months. And then you ask yourself, do you think you could do that? No, I'm too useless. Okay, how about 15 minutes every second day? You think you could do that? You put it in your schedule, like 15 minutes every second day in the morning. And that's, well, you think, well, what's wrong with me? Well, I'm not very good at managing my study schedule. That's not quite down here at the behavioral level, but it's pretty close, because what you can take an action. You can open up your schedule and you can say, oh, I'll mark 15 minutes aside. Then you can practice doing that. It's pretty low level in the hierarchy. It means, well, you're still not a horrible person. You just got to polish up your work ethic. And so what you want to do is it's like the old adage, you got to stand up for yourself, but you don't want to make unnecessary enemies. That's a really good thing to know. It's like, shut the hell up most of the time, but now and then you don't shut up because it's time to say something. You don't want to make unnecessary enemies, though. Well, you don't want to take yourself apart any more than is absolutely necessary. Start little, and you do that with people around you too. Like if you have a child, and the child does something that isn't right, then you think, okay, minimal necessary intervention. What can we do to decrease the probability that that's going to occur in the future? And that's a good thing to know with children. It's also a good thing to know with your partners. You're having an argument with them. It's like, okay, what the hell do you want? What's the minimum thing you can request from them that would satisfy you? And the evil part of your soul is going to be, I want them cringing in a corner. It's like, yeah, get that stuff under control, man. See if you can figure out what that person could offer you that would be minimal that you would accept. And then tell them that. It's like, here's the words I would like you to say in the apology I would like you to formulate, assuming that you think you did something wrong. We have to argue about that because maybe you didn't. But if you did, I want to specify it precisely and narrowly, and I want to give you an escape route. And you might only be able to do it badly because you're still mad. So you apologize half-heartedly. It's like you get a pat on the head for that. Good. Next time it'll be 51%, not half-heartedly. Right? So it's careful training. It's careful training of yourself and other people with the goal in mind, but also with the least amount of harshness possible. And then the other thing to do as well, and this is also true for you, and this is something I learned from studying the behaviorists, is like watch the people around you like a hawk. Whenever they do something that you think is good, you tell them. That's wisdom, man. You'll get so far with that you cannot bloody well believe it, because most people, they're afraid of any number of things, but one of the things they're really afraid of is that now and then they'll creep out of their cynical shell and try to do something good. It's like they're popping out this thing that's unbelievably vulnerable. They'll try to do something good and creep right back into their persona, and they'll look around, see if anyone noticed, and sometimes they'll get punished for it, and then they won't do it again. So don't do that. But then now and then you think, hey, I saw you do this. That was actually pretty good. And they think, oh, wow, someone noticed. It's like, wow. And then they'll think, yeah, I could do that again. And if you want to live with someone for a long period of time, I would say every time they do something that you would like them to do more of, number one, notice. Number two, tell them, right? Because I know you don't want to, because you really want to dominate them. And you don't want them thriving, because then they'd be competition to you, and you wouldn't be able to go complain to your mother about what a miserable partner you have, and you know how delightful that is. So you have to forego all that pleasure if you actually helped your person develop. So you got to get over all that. It's really annoying. So you know you've got this person pegged as, yeah, you're stuck with them, and you know maybe it's the best you can do, but you got one eye open. And then every time they do something good, you don't want to notice, because if that elevated them a little bit, you wouldn't be able to feel so resentful and miserable and keep your eye open for the next possible affair. And that is what people are like. That is what people are like, and that's what you're like too. That's what people are like. So you got to decide if that's what you want, or you want to help the person that you're with grow. You know, now it's dangerous because they might outshine you. Well, good. Then you have someone to compare yourself to. That'd be a good deal. It's really rough with kids, you know, because parents will stop their children from succeeding beyond them. They get jealous, and then they'll put them down, and then they have kids that do not like them, and they'll pay for it. What emotion do you feel when you're going to approach someone you're very attracted to, and there's an extremely high probability that she's going to tell you to disappear? Right, exactly, absolutely, because it's a real judgment, right? We're going to see a movie called Crumb where you'll see this in great detail. But it's a real judgment. It's like the best judgment is, well, I don't mind your physical presence, but your genes should definitely not survive another generation. Right, and that's sort of generally translated into, I think we should just be friends. Right, you know, and you can blow that off, and people do, and you have to, because it's part of being polite and civilized, but you know, let's make no mistake about it. There is no more fundamental judgment than that. So, paralysis. And there's no shortage of men, I mean, who are absolutely terrified of women. I mean, I've had many of them in my practice, you know. I had one guy, he was so terrified of women he couldn't even talk to them on the phone. It's more common than you think. So, but it's generally manifested by men who no one cares about, so it's generally irrelevant. So, well, it's the case. It really is the case. I'm not kidding. They're low status men. You know, they're people that are generally regarded as losers, and there isn't anybody who really gives a damn about what happens to them one way or another. And there's a lot more men in that category than there are women. Women are in all sorts of, you know, social categories that cause them misery and distress, but that one seems to be predominantly male. One of the things I'm going to do when we talk about Freud is I'm going to show you this movie Crumb, which I just told you about, and it's a very rare thing, because it shows you the world from the perspective of very intelligent male losers, and that's just not a perspective you ever see, because it's the winners that tell the stories about their life. It's like, who the hell cares about the life of a loser? But this movie is about a loser who became a winner, and you know, almost as an act of revenge. And it's great. It's great examination of the Oedipal complex. Remarkable. Women select men. That makes them nature, because nature is what selects. And so, you know, you can think, well, it's only symbolic that women are nature. It is, not in some sense, is the gatekeeper to reproductive success. And you can't get more like nature than that. In fact, it's the very definition of nature. So, as I said, there are lots of reasons why these symbolic representations are set up the way they are. Alright, so that's the great mother, nature. The queen, the matrix. The matrix is something from which all things form. Same root word as matter, mother, all the same root word. The matriarch, the container, the cornucopia, the object to be fertilized, the source of all things, the fecund, the pregnant. There are more parts of the associational network. The strange, the emotional, the foreigner, the place of return and rest. The deep, the valley, the cleft, the cave, hell, death, and the grave. The moon, ruler of the night and the mysterious dark, and matter and the earth. So those aren't necessarily associated with femininity, but they're typically associated with femininity from a symbolic perspective. You know, so like generally, like a witch in a movie doesn't come riding out of the full bright sun at noon, right? That just doesn't happen, because it doesn't make sense. It's a dark thing. And so if you saw that occurring in the light in a movie, you'd think, you know, what the hell's going on here? That doesn't make sense. And the reason it doesn't make sense is because it violates the It violates the complex, the symbolic complex. So those are female denizens of the underworld and hell. Very pleasant creatures. It's like Medusa with the head of snakes, you know. And if you ask, you know, why would a woman have a head of snakes in reference to a man? And that's really simple. I bet there are men here who know the answer to that. I don't know what you guys think about this, but I was pretty happy when I thought this up, and it took me a long time. So, if you think about the world in Darwinian terms, right, it's a struggle for survival and reproduction, which are basically the same thing. Survival is you, but reproduction is the survival of your genes. So it's a survival issue over very long spans of time. Okay, what do we call the selection mechanism? Right, natural selection, right? It's nature who does the selection. Okay, so let me tell you something that makes female humans different than female chimps. I mean, there's lots of things that do, but but here's an important one. If you look at which male in a chimp troop fathers most of the offspring, it's the dominant male. But the reason for that isn't because the female chimps sort of flock around the dominant male. Now that happens in other species, but it doesn't happen with chimps. What happens is the dominant male chases all the subordinate males away and will interfere with any sexual behavior they manifest. He'll chase them away. The females, though, are perfectly happy to mate with a subordinate male if they're in heat and they get the opportunity. So they go into heat, which is something that doesn't happen with female humans, and they really don't care who they mate with. Okay, female humans are much different than that. They're picky. So they're choosy. It's a big deal. It's a big deal that they're choosy. Women also seem to evaluate men for their fitness. Now, so, lots of men have no sexual partners and they have no children. That's not the case with women. Almost all women have one child or more. And it's a rare woman indeed who cannot find a sexual partner. Some of you undoubtedly have already experienced what it's like to be possessed by a particularly stupid idea. You know, so maybe you've grown out of one or two of the stupid ideas that possessed you, or maybe you're possessed by an attraction to someone you can't control, or you can't control your eating behavior, or you're a pushover when it comes to interpersonal interactions because you're too agreeable, or you fly off the handle and fight, and you know, none of this is really under your control. And so all of those things that manifest themselves not only in your behaviors but in your perceptions themselves, you know, they tend to take on embodied form and use you as the vehicle for their activity. So, you know, when you're thinking about something like anger, for example, think about how it works, because it's quite peculiar. What must someone generally do? How must someone generally act if you're going to be angry at them? They have to be irritating, right? You know, they have to provoke you in some way. Well, the mere fact that you perceive what they're doing as irritating or provoking doesn't ensure that anyone else would have thought about it, or that that's what they meant, or that that's what's happening. And my point is, it's very important to think about these complexes of ideas as subpersonalities, because otherwise you really don't get what they're like. If you're angry, if you have a proclivity towards anger, especially if it's an unthinking proclivity, anything that someone says might irritate you. And it isn't like they say something and you think about it and then you get irritated. It's like you perceive the person as irritating. You know, maybe it's just the way they hold their mouth or something. It can be very, very subtle. And you might say, well, it's not me, it's you. It's not that I'm irritated by you. It's that you're irritating. And that, you know, that's a very difficult thing to settle, because the reality is somewhere between the subjective and the objective, right? A lot of arguments that you'll have with people throughout your life are about exactly that. Are you irritating or am I oversensitive? It's like, well, you know, we're going to hash that out for a good long time before we figure it out. But the point is that if you're possessed by an emotional state or a motivational state or an idea or some kind of complex, you'll see the world through its eyes. And then the facts reveal themselves to you through the lens of that particular set of ideas. So it's a very frightening idea, because, you know, we like to think of ourselves as masters of our own house, which is completely clueless, because it's obvious if you watch yourself for like a month that you hardly ever do what you tell yourself to do, when you're liable to do all sorts of other things that you don't even want to do. You know, because you say, well, I'm going to go to the gym 3 times a week and I'm not going to drink, you know, and maybe there's this person I'm not going to associate with, and then, you know, you don't go to the gym and you find that person and you go out and drink with them, and you think, what the hell's going on, you know? But you're not the sort of person that will do what you say. And so, like, what sort of person are you? Well, that's a psychoanalytic question. It's a deep one, because you're a peculiar thing. And there's parts of you that are really, really, really old. And you know, the sort of naive you, the naive young you that you think of yourself as is like a little piece of flotsam in an ocean of complexity. And the ocean of complexity is you. And part of diving down into the depths is to start to understand what it means to be human. And like, whatever that means, it's the one thing you can say about it for sure is that it's bloody peculiar. Well, I'll tell you a couple of strange things, things that I don't really understand. The first is, when we've done the analysis of the effects of the future authoring program, it has had a differential impact on men. And it's had a particularly differential impact on what I would call excluded men. And so that would be non-Western ethnic minority men, or what, majority men who aren't doing very well. So for example, at Mohawk College, the future authoring program had a particularly robust effect on Mohawk College students who were men who hadn't done very well in high school and who hadn't picked a major that had a destination, a career destination at its end. So you can imagine those people they have an ambiguous relationship with the idea of education, and they're not oriented specifically towards a goal. They're not very motivated. Now, why did it have a differential effect on men? That's a good question. Well, first of all, the women are doing better. So it might just be a matter of the fact that it does better for people who aren't doing as well, and at the moment most of them are men. I think that might be part of it. But I don't believe that's all of it. I think that part of the reason that women are doing better is because they're agreeable. And so if a system sets out a structure and says, here's a pathway to attainment, the women won't rebel against that, they'll go along with it. And that's working very well for them at the moment. The men, especially the men on the disagreeable end of the distribution, and there's way more men on the disagreeable end of the distribution than there are women, right? That's what you get from, if you look at overlapping normal distributions. So there's the female distribution for agreeableness, male distribution for agreeableness. Tremendous overlap. Okay, women are higher. All the really agreeable people are women. All the really disagreeable people are men. And maybe the real differences occur at the extremes, right? And it's a very interesting side effect of overlapping distributions. So people can be mostly the same, but that can still produce radical differences. Disagreeable men won't do anything they don't want to do. They just say, up yours. I'll go home and play video games. I'm not listening to your stupid classes. And why should I work for you? I'll just go have fun. I'll do my own thing. I don't think they're motivated. And so then if you take the men who are like that and you say, okay, what do you want? You can have what you want, but you have to figure out what it is. So then they write down what they want and they think, oh, hey, well, that might be worth having, so maybe I'll put some effort into it. That's what it looks like to me. Now, that's weak evidence. And this is a weak argument. But I'm trying to stretch out my understanding to account for this. But I'll tell you something else that's really weird. I don't understand this either. So more than 90% of the people who watch my videos on YouTube are men. Now that's weird because about 80% of psychology students are women. So that is not what you would expect, right? You would expect that the majority of them would be women. And you might say, well, it's because of the political stance I've taken. And I thought, well, that's possible. So I went and looked at the demographic data because I have that. Well, before I did any of the political videos, 85% of my viewers were men. So it's actually increased a bit. It's increased by 6%. And that's not trivial, but it was still overwhelmingly men. So that was interesting. I thought, what the hell? Why is that exactly? And then now I've been watching crowds when I've been talking to them. And the crowds that have come to see me in person. This happened at the University of Toronto free speech debate. And I actually noticed it and commented on it before the debate took place because I was talking about intrinsic differences between men and women. And I looked around the room and I thought, hey, 80% of the people in this room are men. So I had all the women stand up and then all the men stand up. I said, look, like, here's a natural experiment. For some reason, 80% of the people who showed up to this are men. Now, everybody thought I was kind of cracked to do that. And it was a risk, but I thought, no, there's something going on here. And then what's interesting now is that every public appearance that I've made that's related to the sort of topics that we're discussing is overwhelmingly men. It's like 85 to 90%. And so I thought, wow, that's weird. Like, what the hell's going on here exactly? And then the other thing I've noticed is that I've been talking a lot to the crowds that I've been talking to, not about rights, but about responsibility, right? Because you can't have the bloody what are you doing? You can't have the conversation about rights without the conversation about responsibility, because your rights are my responsibility. That's what they are, technically. So you just can't have only half of that discussion. And we're only having half that discussion. And the question is, well, what the hell are you leaving out if you only have that half of the discussion? And the answer is, well, you're leaving out responsibility. And then the question is, well, what are you leaving out if you're leaving out responsibility? And the answer might be, well, maybe you're leaving out the meaning of life. That's what it looks like to me. It's like, here you are, suffering away. What makes it worthwhile? Rights? You know, you're completely out. You have no idea what it's almost impossible to describe how bad an idea that is. Responsibility. That's what gives life meaning. It's like lift a load. Then you can tolerate yourself, right? Because look, you're useless, easily hurt, easily killed. Why should you have any self-respect? That's the story of the fall. Pick something up and carry it. Make it heavy enough so that you can think, yeah, well, useless as I am, at least I could move that from there to there. Well, what's really cool about that is that when I talk to these crowds about this, the men's eyes light up. And that's like I've seen that phenomenon because I've been talking about this mythological material for a long time. And I can see when I'm watching crowds, people, you know, their eyebrows lift, their eyes light up because I put something together for them. And that's what mythological stories do. So I'm not taking responsibility for that. That's what the stories do. So I say the story and people go click, 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 you know, and their eyes light up. But this responsibility thing, that's a whole new order of this, is that young men are so hungry for that, it is unbelievable. And one of the things I've been talking to some of the people who've been running for the Conservative leadership in Canada, and I've been talking to them about, well, the difficulties they have communicating with young people, because Conservatives, what the hell are they going to sell to young people, right? Because being Conservative is something that happens when you're older. They can sell responsibility. No one's selling it. And the thing is, for men, there's nothing but responsibility. You know, I was watching The Simpsons the other day. I watched the first Simpsons episode, and I deconstructed it. And so it's really interesting. So what happens in the first Simpson episode is that it's Christmas, and Homer and Marge are going to buy some Christmas presents, but Homer doesn't get his Christmas bonus. And so he's absolutely crushed by that. And that actually is a recurring theme in The Simpsons, where Homer loses his job or something like that, or can't make enough money. He's completely crushed. Even though he's kind of useless, bumbling, laughing fool of a guy, you know, the thing that gives that show its soul is that he's still oriented towards his family. That's what makes him honorable, is that foolish as he is, he's decided to adopt responsibility for his family and to try to bear that. And so he's a holy fool. He's not a complete fool. And it's so interesting watching the story because he suffers dreadfully as a consequence of not being able to fulfill his responsibility. Well, that's for men. Women have their sets of responsibilities. They're not the same, right? Because they're complicated, because women, of course, have to take primary responsibility for having infants at least, but then also for caring for them. They're structured differently than men. For biological necessity, even if it's not a psychological issue, and it's also partly a psychological issue. Women know what they have to do. Men have to figure out what they have to do. And if they have nothing worth living for, then they stay Peter Pan. And why the hell not? Because the alternative to valued responsibility is impulsive, low-class pleasure. And you saw that in the Pinocchio story, right? That's Pleasure Island. It's like, well, why lift a load if there's nothing in it for you? That's another thing that we're doing to men that's a very bad idea. And to boys. It's like, you're pathological and oppressive. It's like, fine then, why the hell am I going to play? If that's the situation, if I get no credit for bearing responsibility, you can bloody well be sure I'm not going to bear any. But then, you know, your life is useless and meaningless, and you're full of self-contempt and nihilism, and that's not good. And so that's why I think, that's what I think's going on at a deeper level with regards to men needing this direction. A man has to decide that he's going to do something. He has to decide that. Yeah, well, you know, partly what you're trying to do in the future authoring process is say, okay, well, what's your highest value? Right? It's the star. It's like, okay, what are you aiming for? You can decide, man. But, you know, there's some criteria. It should be good for you. It should be good for you in a way that facilitates your moving forward. Maybe it should be good for you in a way that's also good for the family and the community. It should cover the domain of life. I mean, there's constraints on what you should regard as a value, but within those constraints you have the choice. You have choice. Well, the thing is that people will carry a heavy load if they get to pick the goddamn load. So, and they think, well, I won't carry any load. It's like, okay, fine, but then you're like the sled dog that doesn't have a sled to pull. You're gonna tear pieces out of your own legs because you're bored. You know, people are pack animals. They need to pull against a weight. And that's not true for everyone. It's not true particularly, say, for low conscientious people. I mean, maybe they're open and creative or extroverted and some other things. But for the typical person, they'll eat themselves up unless they have a load. This is why there's such an opiate epidemic among dispossessed white middle-aged guys who are unemployed in the US. It's like they lose their job, they're done, right? They despise themselves. They develop chronic pain syndromes and depression, and the chronic pain is treated with opiates. It's like that's what we're doing. So yeah, that's what it looks like to me. Is you have to, and it's so interesting to watch the young men when you talk to them about responsibility. They're so goddamn thrilled about it. It just blows me away. It's like, really? That's the counterculture. Grow the hell up and do something useful. Really? I could do that? Oh, I'm so excited by that idea. No one ever mentioned that before. It's like rights, 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 rights. Jesus, it's appalling. And I feel that that's deeply felt by the people who are coming out to listen to these sorts of things too. They've had enough of that. So, and they better have, because it's a non-productive mode of being. Responsibility, man. That's where the meaning in life is. So. If you're resentful about something, well, first of all, you should notice, I'm resentful. And that's kind of humiliating because no one's proud of being resentful. It's a shameful emotion. Oh, so then why are you resentful? Well, there's only two reasons as far as I've been able to tell. One is that you're allowing yourself to be taken advantage of, or you're being taken advantage of. Sometimes you're not allowing yourself. Sometimes you're a child being abused by their uncle. You're not allowing yourself. You can't do anything about it. You're resentful because you're being taken advantage of, or because you're immature. It's one of those two things. Figure out which it is, and then take the steps necessary to address it. Living a life without resentment is a great goal. People are often resentful if they see that responsibility has been abdicated. Why isn't that person doing their job? It's like, well, hey man, step in at your workplace, in your family. You know, and you think, well, I shouldn't have to do that extra work. Well, you shouldn't be a slave. You shouldn't allow yourself to be tyrannized. But if something bugs you because a responsibility is going unfulfilled, there's a great opportunity for you. And this is something I don't think we teach young people well. And one of the things, you may remember this, that was so striking about the tour was that I made a case fairly consistently that most people find the meaning that sustains them through the vicissitudes of life, not in happiness, but in responsibility. And that would bring everyone to a halt. It would always make the whole theater silent. It's like, oh, I never thought of that connection. Because maybe you want to avoid responsibility, and you can understand why. You can understand why. You hide from it. That is what you encounter if you go out in the world. You think, who the hell wants that? I don't want the responsibility. It's like, well, yes, you do, as it turns out. There's nothing better than responsibility. Now, you know, I say that with some caution. I think that it's hard to say. The responsibility, I've been overwhelmed by my apparent responsibility, but I think it's also kept me alive. And I mean that literally. And so,
wait, can you go a little deeper with that? I mean, when you were at your darkest moments in the last 2 years, whatever that might be, was it the feeling
well,
of
there's been
the...
many times in the last year where it would have been much easier for me just to be dead. That's constant. So, but no.
But is it but no because of something in you, or is it but no because of the people that you would have abdicated that responsibility of the people, or is that ultimately the same
That's
thing?
it.
Yeah.
Well, I do think the two aren't easily distinguishable, but it's definitely that. It's definitely that. You know. And it's one of the chapters, the last chapter, is be grateful in spite of your suffering. You know, you need a meaning to sustain you through suffering. And it is the case that you find that in responsibility. Well, and so it's good advice for anyone who's at work. You're resentful about this and that because people aren't pulling their weight. Pull it. See what happens. You become indispensable instantly. You'll know everything. And maybe that job won't be for you, or maybe that relationship won't be for you, but you'll take your hard acquired wisdom and go elsewhere and flourish there. So, you know, this kid stopped me. I think I wrote about this in this book. Kid stopped me in a restaurant one day when I was walking in, and he said, and he had an undergraduate degree, and he was working as a waiter in a chain steak place. And he stopped me and he said, you know, about 6 months ago, I was watching one of your lectures and I decided to stop being resentful about my job. And he was resentful because he had a university degree and he's working as a waiter. You know, and look, I don't have anything against waiters. It's like a waiter can make your evening, you know, hooray. He said, well, I decided I'd start trying at my job, like really trying as if it was worthwhile. He said he got 3 promotions in 6 months, like he's just rocketing up the power hierarchy. Well, it's not power, it's competence if it's well run. You know, and places are full of opportunity.
There's always people out there who are doing far better than you on pretty much anything you want to imagine. And if all you're doing is seeing yourself in their reflected light, let's say, then it's going to be pretty damn dismal. But it's not a good comparison because, well, first of all, there's danger in just comparing yourself to others, period, because they're not you. And God only knows what struggles they had to undertake to get to where they were, or what burdens they're currently carrying that you're not aware of. But you can certainly contrast yourself with yourself. And that's a lot better. It is the only way. Well, it's also the only way of really measuring anything approximating proper improvement. You can actually tell when you're a little better than you were yesterday.
Right.
And you can actually do that. That's another thing that's so interesting about it, is that you can actually make yourself a little better in some way, pretty much. Well, I don't know if it's at every moment, but you can certainly do it every day. Let's say you want to become who you could be in the fullest sense. So let's say you're someone who's going to solve some serious problems. Okay, the first thing you have to do is admit to the seriousness of the problems. That's no joke. And so the first thing is just the terror of the problem itself. And that's enough to paralyze me. And that's the Hydra, that's the Gorgon with the head of snakes. It'll paralyze and turn you to stone. That's the basilisk in the Harry Potter series. Mm-hmm. You look at it and it turns you to stone and lurks underneath everything, right? And it's malevolence and tragedy. And so there's that. And then the next is, well, you're going to take responsibility for that? You're really going to do that, are you? That's a hell of a load, man. And so it's daunting to even consider that. And then there's the discipline and responsibility that necessitates, which is also daunting. It's like, oh my God, the problem's that serious. I'm really going to have to get my act together in order to not contribute to it, much less solve it. And so the problem is terrible. And then the solution is daunting. But the upside of that is like, well, there isn't anything better to have than a problem that's worth solving, like that's really worth solving. Right. And so the more of that you take on, the more you have a reason to get out of bed in the morning, no matter what. Like, I'm getting up, I'm trudging forward. Doesn't matter what I'm suffering from. I've got things that need to be done. They're necessary. And that gives you that sense of purpose that is the antidote to bitterness. Okay, well, let's say you want your life to be meaningful. It's like, okay, then what you do matters. It actually matters. Or how starting to clean up the room changed their life. That's quite fun because it's something I always tell people to do instead of going out and protesting. Jesus, I just can't stand
Cleaning up
that.
the room?
Yeah.
Meaning?
Well, my sense is that if you want to change the world, you start from yourself and work outward because you build your competence that way. It's like, I don't know how you can go out and protest the structure of the entire economic system if you can't keep your room organized. Well, I made a video call, which was called Message to Millennials, where it was called How to Change the World Properly. A bit of it on the pretentious side, I suppose, but I was trying to produce something that was a counterposition to this idea that what you should do is go out and fix up other people. You know, that's just not right. And there's a New Testament line about that, something about, you know, not worrying too much about the log in your neighbor's eye, or about the speck in your neighbor's eye when you have a log in your eye. What would the world be like if people
stopped avoiding the things they knew they should do. You know, because the question is, how much are we contributing to the fact that life is an existential catastrophe and a tragedy? How much is our own corruption contributing to that? That's a really worthwhile question. The things you leave undone because you're angry, you're resentful, you're lazy, you have inertia. Well, you consult your conscience and it says, well, you know, that place over there could use a little work. It's the same as working on yourself, and so you clean that up because you can. And then things are a little clearer around you. And you're a little better off because you've practiced a bit, and so you're a little stronger, and then something else manifests itself and says, well, maybe you could like take a crack at fixing me up too. So you decide to do that, and then that gets a little bit more pristine, you know, and soon, and it's humble because you're not exceeding your domain of competence. You know, it's like, don't be fixing up the economy, 18-year-olds. You don't know anything about the economy. It's a massive, complex machine beyond anyone's understanding, and you mess with it at your peril. So, and can you even clean up your own room? No. Well, you should think about that. You should think about that. The hallmark of true sovereignty is the willingness of the elite, let's say the talented, the productive, the blessed, the gifted, to justify the unequal division of talent by serving to ameliorate the catastrophic suffering of the dispossessed. Now, Nietzsche warned about that, right? He thought that Christianity would devolve in some sense into the woke nightmare that it has devolved into. But I think he failed to give the devil his entire due. And the notion that the highest is the highest because it voluntarily serves the lowest, that's a deadly idea. And I don't think it's an ideological idea at all. I think it's an idea that removes the paradox of human existence. And so there's that, but then there's another insistence in both Judaism and Christianity, and I'm not saying it's limited to those doctrines, by the way, that the way to deal with suffering is not to avoid it or to circumvent it with a shallow hedonism, but to face it intensely, head on, and voluntarily in its full manifestation. And so one of the things I've realized about the Passion story, which Jung regarded as an archetypal tragedy and in some sense a limit case, right? A story so tragic that you cannot write a more tragic story.
Right.
Is that it drags the observer, and so that's all of us in Christendom, through the entire catastrophe of human existence, right? So it confronts you with the mob that's after you, that you are also part of. It confronts you with moral relativism in the shape of Pontius Pilate. It confronts you with the oppression of the totalitarian state of foreigners, let's say, in the guise of Rome. It confronts you with the betrayal of your best friend. It confronts you with the willingness of the crowd to punish the virtuous and free the criminal. And that's the story of Barabbas and Christ. And Pajot told me the other day, Jonathan Pajot, that an alternative name for Barabbas was Jesus. And that what the crowd did was pick the political revolutionary over the spiritual leader. And that's perfect. And then it confronts you with the reality that we all face our own mortality, and too early. And the fact that sometimes the innocent and virtuous are punished. And so and then of course there's the horrible, tragic, torturous death, all of that. And that's all signified by the image of the crucifix and what we're doing to ourselves, even though we don't know it. I'm speaking mostly psychologically, although somewhat theologically, is that we're exposing ourselves to the ultimate catastrophe of human existence, while simultaneously manifesting the faith that if we face that unflinchingly, that will resurrect us instead of killing us.
That's quite powerful.
It's something, man. It's something. It's something I've been puzzling out for, well, a long time, but particularly for the last 6 months. I'm going to write about that in my new book. And when I talk to my audiences about that, you know, and I would especially say this has an impact, again, on demoralized young men, and say, look, we don't know the limits to the expansion of your personality if you're willing to face things without deception. And that's a variant of that radical honesty we were already talking about. Don't live by lies. Well, life is rife with injustice, atrocity, and suffering.
And so what do you do with that? Do you avoid it? There's good physiological evidence, by the way, that if you take two groups of people and you subject one group to a stressor involuntarily, and you get the other group to take on the stressor voluntarily, that the pattern of psychophysiological response is entirely different. It's entirely different emotionally, motivationally, and in terms of the damage it does. And so the involuntary imposition of a threat is stressful and damaging, but the voluntary acceptance of a threat is invigorating and revivifying.
No, it would be nice if we could be optimistic. And I think, again, the problem with being optimistic is that it's naive. So then the question is there an optimism that's not naive? And I think there is. And the optimism that's not naive is in just a visualization of how strong people can be. So one of the things that I tell people, I've told my students in my class, in Maps of Meaning, here's a goal. You want to be the person at the funeral of your father that everyone can rely on. How would that be? You want to be the person who's broken and useless and adding to the misery in the corner. And look, I'm not making light of people's grief. You know, I understand grief. But who do you want to be when there's a crisis? Right? Do you want to be the person that everyone can turn to for strength? It's like, why the hell not? Why not that as a goal? That'd be a good goal, because then if there's a crisis, and there will be, it won't be such a bloody crisis, because there'll be someone there that can deal with it. You know, so when I went and talked to these people at the funeral home, I envisioned that. I thought, okay, well, this is something you have to contend with if you're going to be alive and adult. You have to contend with death and suffering, and you have to be ready for it. And you have to be there for the person, because that's all they're going to have. And so there's a goal, man. And in this time of nihilism, you know, it's what's the point of life? People ask, and they're taught that at universities. What's the point of life? Everything's interpretation. Humanity's a cancer on the planet. You know? Well, how about no? How about not that? How about that there's something to us